So just to remind members and witnesses alike, if they could please turn off mobile phones, interference caused to the sound quality and transmission of the meeting. I'd like to welcome today to our committee from Social Justice Ireland, Dr. Sean Healy, accompanied by Michelle Murphy and Eamon Murphy. From NERI, Dr. Tom MacDonald, Senior Economist, and he's accompanied by Kieran Nugent. And from ICTU, Ger Gibbons, their Social Policy and Legislative Officer. I'd like to thank you all for making yourselves available to meet our committee today. It's part of our pre-budget consultation process. We are holding two sessions actually today to meet with selected national stakeholders. And we'll be obviously holding further sessions again in September. So the format for our meeting today, just to let you know, will be to ask each of our witnesses to make an opening statement, and then I'll open it to a question and answer session for the members. But before we go into that, just to run through the usual statement on privilege. I wish to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House, an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, having run through the privilege statement, I'm now going to start straight away by asking our first person today to make their opening statement. We'll take all the opening statements before obviously we go to the Q&A. So Dr. Healy, can I ask you to make your opening statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and we're very welcome to have this opportunity to meet the committee, and we think the work of this committee is very, very important, and that's why we put a lot of work into trying to present good ideas for you for consideration. Not everything can go into the opening statement, obviously, so if people want to pursue any issues, we're more than happy to deal with those in the questions that follow. I suppose on the surface, Ireland is performing very well on a whole range of issues. Our economy is growing, our employment numbers are high, unemployment is low, a whole lot of different things. But on a closer analysis, there are some very serious issues. We have a housing crisis, we have a persistent poverty and social exclusion problems, we have a long waiting lists on healthcare, we have issues of major proportions on issues like climate change, and there is so much else that would actually bring into question really how well Ireland is performing in an overall kind of way. So what for us is important is that we recognise that budgets are about choices. In making these choices, government is shaping the society of the future, and it's putting in place the various components of what it considers to be a good society, the infrastructure, the services and so on, that will shape the future. We believe that Budget 2020 should be designed so it is both economically sound and socially fair, and these twin objectives are both realistic and achievable. These can be delivered on, but they need to be underpinned by clear policy commitment and by budget decisions aimed at achieving both. Some specific issues to address. First of all, the issue of the fiscal position, the overall fiscal position. I think the fiscal space is a critical issue, and government has the freedom in Budget 2020 and in any future budget to generate additional taxation revenue from raising taxes in one area and then spending or investing this money elsewhere. But I think for us there is an issue about the transparency of the budget where the fiscal space is actually concerned. We note with concern that the table setting out the available fiscal space for the next budget, which was previously included in the Stability Programme Update, has been omitted from the draft Stability Programme Update 2019 published in April. To facilitate informed comment and engagement with the budget process, the details usually contained in this table should be made available in the public arena. Moving on to the issue of public expenditure and exchequer receipts policy, we believe in Social Justice Ireland that over the next few years, policy should focus on increasing Ireland's total tax take. The reason for this is that there are very We think this move in this direction is unavoidable if we are to try to deal with the gaps in infrastructure and the gaps in social provision that it currently exists. Plus, if we are going to be able to deal effectively with the other issues that emerge and the bills that have to be met in the period immediately ahead. Now, we propose a new total tax take target to be set on a per capita basis. We think that using GDP, GNI star, these things are problematic in terms of trying to set targets. So we say, OK, what we've done is we've set out targets based on a per capita basis. And the target would be that Ireland's overall level of taxation would reach, now this is overall taxation, not just income tax, that Ireland's overall level of taxation should reach a level equivalent to €15,000 per capita in 2017 terms, and this target should increase each year, obviously, in line with the growth in GNI star. And we calculate that the difference between the level of taxation if by continuing with things as they are and what we're proposing in the year 2019, the total difference would be about €3.5 billion. Increasing the overall tax take to this level would require a number of changes to the tax base and the current structure of the Irish tax system, and increasing the overall taxation revenue to meet this new target would represent a small overall increase in taxation levels, but one which is unlikely to have any significant negative impact on the economy and would still keep Ireland as a relatively low tax take country. Another issue that we think is important in a budgetary context to be addressed is the issue of demography. We think that demography will have a significant impact on Ireland's budgetary position going forward. Our growing population, our ageing population will require increased spending at certain stages in all levels of public expenditure, from early childhood education and care, through education and healthcare and into pensions and obviously care and social care for older people. These issues should be part of the framing of Ireland's overall fiscal position. In the broader context, there's also the issue of windfall gains in taxation. We think they should be used to provide investment for non-recurring infrastructure projects, such as the provision of social housing or primary healthcare centres and the rolling out of those networks, and rural broadband, those kinds of things. Because the money can be spent to, we'll say, if you build the houses, they're built. Once they're built, they don't have to be built again next year. It's a one-off expenditure, and because of the fact that it may well be a one-off income coming to the state, then a one-off revenue, we have to do that. So we would argue that delivering a just taxation system would currently require three things: increasing the overall tax take is the first thing that we've been talking about. Secondly, to adopt policies to broaden the tax base, and thirdly, to develop the tax system fairly. And in order to achieve a budget that is economically sound and socially fair, it's obviously there are other issues that have to be dealt with besides the taxation issue that we've been talking about. But those issues have to be addressed simultaneously, particularly areas around the social development, economic development and environmental development in the country have to be addressed simultaneously. We would say that there should be 5 policy goals or 5 overall goals to the budget, that the budget should seek to develop a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance and sustainability. Now, we can spell out each of those into a series of proposals, and then we can break down those proposals and so on. And we have those on page 3 of our budget choices policy briefing that we circulated to you in advance of today's meeting. I just draw your attention finally. In this policy briefing called Budget Choices, we have set out a fully costed set of proposals. We have also identified how those proposals can be paid for and the impact they have on the overall budget. And I draw your attention to page 16 of the document, in which we set out all our taxation proposals and what the income would be from those. We then, on page 17, spell out all our expenditure proposals and the money that would be available, or they would cost. And then we balance the books, if you like, on page 18. We show you what's involved there, so that we're, if you like, being totally transparent. Every proposal we make is costed, and we show how it can be financed. And we recommend it to you. If there's, as a set of proposals for a fully integrated approach along the lines that we're talking about, socially, economically and environmentally integrated, where the decisions are taken simultaneously. Therefore, you don't have one sort of not dealing with the other. We can be as specific as you like on any of these in the questions later. I just wanted to keep within the 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you did keep very much towards that 6 minute time frame we're working towards for opening statements. So thank you very much for that one. I'll say nothing. The next one is the next person, and I would ask to make the opening statement is Dr. McDonald. Again, that's 6 minute time frame. Thank you very much.
That's my 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. And indeed the rest of the members for this opportunity to appear before the committee. We're very grateful for that opportunity. Accompanying me today are Ciarán Nugent of the NERI and Gerard Gibbons of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Obviously, we're happy to answer questions. And as Dr. Healy pointed out, obviously a 6 minute statement can only cover so much ground, so the accompanying submissions should be considered as well.
Afterwards, don't worry.
Great. Well, I suppose the first point I want to make is that our analysis of the available evidence is that the Irish economy is not yet overheating. However, this is likely to change before the end of 2019 in the absence of a negative external shock, such as a disorderly Brexit, which could quickly catapult us in the opposite direction. The various Brexit permutations mean that short-run forecasting is itself particularly uncertain. Nevertheless, the medium and long-run sustainability questions should continue to guide the fiscal stance taken by the government. Now, in our view, the overall fiscal position is reasonably solid, at least ostensibly, with a neutral headline general government balance of 0% of GDP in 2018. In addition, our view is that the structural or cyclically adjusted balance was marginally in surplus in 2018. So effectively, the public finances are now in balance, notwithstanding our high debt levels. Baseline average potential output growth of 4.5% is feasible over the 2020s. This sets a baseline for a sustainable average annual nominal increase in public spending, net of discretionary revenue measures. When we take into account demographic and inflationary pressures, the real per person increase will be close to just half this amount. Brexit will marginally reduce potential output growth over the 2020s, no matter what form it takes, and this will therefore impinge on the annual fiscal space available to government. However, I would note that often the effects of Brexit on the amount of fiscal space available each year can be overstated, and I'm happy to talk about that later on. The other major source of uncertainty relating to the budgetary position is the sustainability of corporation tax receipts. The surge in receipts in recent years caught policymakers and analysts by surprise. Changes to the treatment of corporation tax at EU and international levels, which are likely in over the next 2 years, may undermine the flow of revenue from this source, at least at the Irish level. Therefore, it is contentious as to whether or not some of those corporation tax receipts should be considered part of our structural tax base at the moment. And what this means is it suggests at least a more cautious fiscal stance until we have greater certainty in relation to the future levels of revenue. Now, the NERI has produced a number of papers in recent years showing that Ireland's per capita public spending and per capita government revenue are both below average compared to peer high-income EU countries, which refers to all of the other countries in the EU with a GDP per capita of 30,000 or greater. I refer the committee to the accompanying NERI submission, and I'm happy to discuss this in greater depth. Given the increasing demand pressures, Ireland's position in the economic cycle and the negative implications for inclusive growth in public services, it is our view that a package of discretionary revenue measures that reduces net government revenue would be an unwise course of action for Budget 2020. Ireland has a number of emerging challenges as we approach a new decade. These include Brexit, climate chaos, precarious work and inequality, housing and homelessness emergencies, a two-tier health system, the fiscal implications of a growing and ageing population, the fragility of an industrial strategy based on tax-sensitive US multinationals. In particular, the risk of a no-deal Brexit has increased since the start of this year. Now is the time to invest in our people, our public services and our infrastructure. A substantial increase in productive investment, which I know will happen over the next few years, is the only way we can ensure our future prosperity in a sustainable and inclusive way. Brexit does not change this fundamental reality, and fundamentally Brexit should not change budgetary policy in Ireland over the medium term. Good policies will remain good policies. Now, the next point is that Congress is advocating, by which I mean the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, is advocating for a radical progressive vision for Ireland's economy and society. Its submission for Budget 2020, which will come over the summer and is currently being finalised, will outline a series of proposals that will start us on the journey to realising that vision. Congress has consistently argued for an inclusive, equality-proof budget that places the welfare and betterment of the majority at its very core, a budget that will prioritise higher living standards, particularly for workers and their families, and deliver this through a transformative programme of investment in infrastructure, services and service delivery. In particular, the budget submission will articulate the need to invest more in a wide range of different areas, including in social and affordable housing, in healthcare, in childcare and education, in clean and renewable energy, and in public transport. Achieving these goals means abandoning attempts to cut taxes on a net basis. Such policies will help overheat the economy and will actually harm workers in the long run. Indeed, Congress has proposed new taxes on capital, particularly on wealth stocks and wealth and property stocks, in order to raise money for productive social and economic investment. In principle, Congress would support an increase in the carbon tax, but only contingent on an accompanying and linked climate justice fund that would channel the revenue raised in the form of a dividend for every person living in Ireland. Our plan would see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, while the average household in the bottom half of the income distribution would see their purchasing power increase after the introduction of the linked carbon tax and annual dividend. That is, they would receive more in the form of a dividend than they would expect to pay in a carbon tax. Households who change behaviour and opt for less carbon-intensive modes of consumption will see their gains increase. We're happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I now have we have an open statement from Ger Gibbons. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much for that. Well, if that is the conclusion of our opening statements, we're going to open it up for questions. So I have a number of people who've indicated, and the first deputy was Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks. And I'll be brief. The first question is just in relation to the overheating of the economy. You predict the end of 2019. Can you give us maybe some detail on what areas are causing or have the potential to cause that overheating? That's the first thing. And the second one is, how do we combat it? Because all of the reports I've seen to date suggest that the potential for overheating comes within the construction sector, and not so much on the housing side, but on the non-domestic side, like hotels, office blocks, and how do you combat that? You also have the difficulty where we have a massive demand for housing, and we're not meeting that supply. What's the likelihood, if we start ramping up our housing programmes, that could actually lead to overheating in the economy as well? And also the skills shortage that may be there. How do we address that? If you could just comment on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the questions, Deputy O'Brien. Why would the economy overheat? Well, the element of the cyclical position of the economy is not something that one can observe directly. So what we do is you look at a range of indicators, you have a series of models underlying that, and ultimately the various forecasting houses and institutions come to a judgment as to the cyclical position. It's a notoriously difficult area, so I'm saying this at the start by, in a sense, being humble and saying it is difficult to know at what point an economy overheats. So, for example, the Irish economy is now moving to an unemployment rate of between 4 and 5%. That would normally be suggestive of an economy that is close to capacity. However, other economies, such as the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Czech Republic, have been managing below 4% for a number of years now. And in terms of our employment rate, labour force participation, we still do much worse than a number of other countries. In addition, our inflation rates and so on would suggest, and wage rates would suggest, that we're not quite there yet. Having said that, the economy has been now in a cyclical upswing for close to 7 years. We are starting to arrive at a point where there are skill shortages in the economy. We are seeing wages increase, and it is likely that we will start to see an acceleration of that process over the next 12 months, with the big asterisks of Brexit. So what is likely to cause overheating? Well, one of the distinctive factors about the construction sector in particular is it tends to respond with a kind of a lag effect to other demand factors in the economy. So what we're starting to see is a ramping up of house building in the economy now. And as you point out, there are skill shortages there. And that ramping up of housing, both based on private funding and public funding, will, in our view, start to push the economy into a position where it starts to overheat. That would be consistent there then with us moving towards a trade deficit, higher nominal wage growth, higher inflation, and so on. How does one combat overheating from occurring? Well, normally one responds through fiscal and monetary policy. So you could do it through fiscal policy by increasing taxes, for example, or perhaps by cutting public infrastructure spending. Unfortunately, our infrastructure spending has been so low for so long now that that's clearly not an option for us. We have infrastructure deficits compared to peer countries in so many areas. So that implies caution in other areas of fiscal policy, and that obviously points to current spending, but also to taxation. So we would be very cautious then, and very worried if there was to be a stance taken which would involve significant tax cuts, for example, particularly on a net basis. I'm talking here there about VAT and about income tax. As to overheating being on the non-domestic side, it is true that a lot of the construction activities in recent years has been on the non-domestic side. We expect that to change somewhat in upcoming years in response to demand. The rise in house prices has made it more viable to make profits in the private sector, for example. Increased intervention on the public side. Having said that, it is an issue, and the question about overheating again is completely contingent upon what happens in terms of Brexit. Disorderly Brexit will be a major shock to the economy. From a fiscal policy point of view, what one does is you have a structural surplus now of maybe 0.1% of potential output. The implication, therefore, is that you simply stick to using your fiscal space year on year. Using your fiscal space year on year keeps you at where you were in terms of the structural balance. So that's non-contractionary, non-expansionary. These overheating effects, you don't feed into it, but at the same time you have to be very, very cautious about cutting against the grain, particularly as the budget will happen a few weeks before any potential Brexit outcome. So I'd be cautious about being too contractionary in Budget 2020 in advance of a potentially significant and large shock which could propel the European economy into a recession. I don't know if that answers the question. Do you want to briefly talk about skill shortages, Kieran?
Well, I think you covered it there, Tom, to be honest.
The second area I want to just touch on is corporation tax and just the whole tax base in general. I mean, we hear so much around expenditure and how government is trying to control spending, that all of the opposition parties are looking for more to be spent. But we hear very little then on the other side when we come to tax. We hear a lot about widening and broadening our tax base, but we hear very little when it comes to corporation tax breaks for banks, tax incentives, tax avoidance, and trying to address areas like that. Would you have any comment in relation to that? And maybe, Sean, you might be able to comment on that as well, at a time when we have so much need, and we have, you know, increasing levels of abject poverty and a housing crisis. I mean, how realistic or how feasible is it to continue giving tax breaks to banks which are making millions?
We have a very strong position on what needs to be done with tax. So I'll hand you over to my colleague Eamon Murphy to kind of set it out. We have given you a document which has quite a number of pages setting out all the details there. But let Eamon do a summary.
And thanks very much for the question, Deputy O'Brien. As Sean said, we have this document, our budget choice of 2020. It's our budget submission. It's on the website, and I believe you've all had a copy sent to you. Pages 4 to 7 deal with our policies and on our proposals on taxation, and particularly pages 5 and 6 will deal with a lot of the issues that you mentioned there. You hit the nail on the head there by mentioning the need to broaden the tax base and to do so in a sustainable way, and corporation tax has a huge role to play. Most of actually the revenue raising proposals that we've made in that area are more reform elements than increases. At the moment, it's well documented that several large multinationals based in Ireland are paying effective rates of corporation tax well below the headline that we set out, the 12.5%. That's such an article of faith in Irish politics. One of the proposals we made in our budget submission was to set a minimum effective corporation tax rate of 6% in order to ensure that those corporations are making a fair contribution to the Irish Exchequer, but also in relation to specifically what you raised there, the feasibility of allowing banks to continue what's effectively a corporation tax holiday. We believe that there should be a limit to the ability of corporations to carry their losses forward, limited to 10 years, and a cap should be returned to 50% on that. Now, we're being fair about that. We acknowledge there's a need to remove the bank levy if that's going to be the case, but that would see upwards of €100 million perhaps being raised in 2020 alone. The extent to which banks have been allowed to roll those losses forward are effectively penalising the Irish taxpayer twice for the actions taken by the banks during the 2000s. It's already the situation that these institutions wouldn't exist in the current format if it wasn't for the taxpayer, and they should now start making a proper contribution back to society. Overall, we think that Ireland needs to take a leadership role in relation to the international moves that have been happening over the last few years in relation to setting minimum effective levels of corporation tax, creating a consolidated corporation tax base, and we need to get out ahead of what's an inevitability, really. We think that there is quite a time-limited aspect now to the current system of Irish corporation tax, and that we need to get out ahead of that and take a lead on setting a European-wide minimum to create a fairer system.
If maybe, Tom, you could just comment as well. And
Sure.
you know, one of the arguments that's given back to those of us who call for those CT holidays to be lifted is that there could be unintended consequences. Are there any unintended consequences that you would be aware of if you were to deal with the issue of the banks and the breaks that they get?
Well, I will answer that. First, I'd like to echo the points about the Common Consolidated Corporation Tax Base in the sense that it's going to happen sometime in the next 10 years because the Americans and the Europeans are both pushing for this. And so it would be wise for Ireland to bake those potential losses into its fiscal policy. So the Fiscal Council, for example, as you know, has been trying to estimate the potential losses in revenue to Ireland, and is coming up with figures between 3 and 6 billion. I think that's actually too high. I don't think it'll be that high. But if a common consolidated corporation tax base comes into place, that will certainly impact the public finances to the tune of close to 2 billion. And I think it would be wise if the committee and the government bake that into their figures. In terms of the impact upon the banks of getting rid of those particular breaks, I mean, in principle, Nevin, and I think Congress too, have consistently taken a position that broadly one should move to a system where tax expenditures, full stop, are squeezed out of the system. They tend to be economically inefficient, they tend to be regressive, they tend to be non-transparent, and they're a form of public spending that is never acknowledged. Having said that, if you do get rid of existing tax breaks, it is important to give a window or a period of time or a period of notice, because often the business will have already assumed that those tax breaks are in place. So the risk, and I'm not saying that it is an existential risk, but the risk would be that you could suddenly plunge a bank into another crisis. I'm not saying that that would happen. What I'm saying is that when a tax break is in place, and tax breaks should always, and that's actually a pretty standard one, when tax break is in place like that, particularly when it relates to the business sector, it is a good idea to introduce the legislation to take effect a few years down the line rather than to take effect immediately because of the potential short-term implications. But I couldn't give you an answer on the direct and immediate impact on the banks of making those changes.
Thanks, John.
One very simple. It's just from the point of view of the tax expenditures issue, we would strongly view that these need to be constantly under review. The Commission on Taxation did it. Its longest chapter is about tax expenditures, and it's very insightful, I think. And we need to keep pace by having. We would say two things. It should be introduced. One is that there should be an annual update as part of the budget process of what tax expenditures are costing us. We have all this expenditure in the budget, you know, health, education, all this kind of stuff. We count all that and we've all the lines and so on. We should have it similarly on tax expenditures. And the second thing we should do is have a sunset clause on every single tax expenditure that's out there, that it has to be reviewed. It doesn't mean that it has to end, but it has to be reviewed before you go at it again. And I think that would be a positive step in the right direction.
The Chair might comment on this. This committee has actually done an extensive bit of work.
I was just going to say that pretty much mirrors our report in terms of recommendations. Deputy Brown, thank you very much, Deputy Brown. The next is Deputy Chambers.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you both for your presentation. Just a couple of different questions to both. If I can start with you, Mr. Healy, just in terms of your recommendations around childcare and the expense of it. For many families, it's a second mortgage, effectively. And one of the things I think holding back a more equal and just society is that we don't have access to affordable childcare. And I understand what you're saying around the tax base and widening it and increasing taxation, but what are your views then on where we're at in terms of childcare provision in this country, what's needed to happen next? And I'd welcome your views also on a piece of legislation that has passed second stage in this House but has actually stalled. And it was a suggestion or an idea around sharing current entitlements that already exist. And this is actually a question to both. One of the difficulties we have 50% of the population thereabouts are female, and there are more barriers to getting back into employment and sustaining maybe higher paid employment and working full time because of the childcare issue, because the caring responsibilities tend to fall, because of the way the system is set up, tend to fall to mum more than dad. And one of the issues, particularly for women that are self-employed or indeed in public life, is that you don't get maternity leave, but neither can you transfer the maternity leave to your partner. So effectively the family lose that leave that is already there. What are your views on allowing a mum to transfer that leave, either all or part or whatever he or she chooses within the family, to try and cater for women that are self-employed, running their own business or in public life that don't have access to maternity leave? I think we need to start thinking outside the box, because paternity leave is fantastic, and obviously what we want to get to, the gold-plated standard, is to try and get to a year for mum and dad at home with baby. That's what we want to get to. But we're looking at increasing paternity leave by maybe 2 weeks, maybe up to 7 weeks in 3, 4 or 5 years' time, whenever it happens. We just don't know. But it's a long, slow, dragged-out process. So to try and ease that burden now, and that women, if they were better enabled to get into the workplace, that benefits everybody, not just women themselves. So maybe just that question first, probably to both.
Whoever would like to.
Just, first of all, there is a huge problem with the scale of childcare in Ireland, and there is a serious challenge about the quality of childcare as well, because this quality childcare we need. So we have some ideas about that, and to elaborate on those, I'll ask my colleague Michelle Murphy to fill you in on where we're at on those.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Deputy Chambers. Yes, so page 12 of our document actually outlines our proposals.
Yeah, I just got that open here. Actually,
yeah, so I suppose in turn, yes, childcare is a significant cost burden on families. For, I suppose, if you look at it in the life cycle, it's only actually quite a short period of your time that you're faced with this significant cost burden, but it's an area that requires significant investment. I suppose the challenge at present is the sector is, I suppose, quite fragmented, and we've relied on private provision, and so the private providers are struggling between, paying decent wage to their employees and then expanding their service and meeting the ratios. So, I mean, one of our proposals there is to look at how you might address the funding element so that you separate the wage element from professionalisation of the sector. So, looking at parts of the ECCE scheme, which is for 3 years plus, and how you might apply that to from the 0 to 3 years, and how the state might actually support the sector in terms of professionalisation, quality and affordability for families, and looking at how you might expand and improve the model. So we're looking for 85 million euros in the current budget for this. And in addition to this, I suppose you need to look at how you might expand the sector to incorporate particularly childminders for those living outside of urban settings as well, and how you deal with the informal care element. In terms of what the second issue that you brought up there in terms of sharing current entitlements and the legislation that's going through, and perhaps for the potential for a self-employed woman to transfer the maternity leave, I suppose in principle this would be a positive step if it led to, I suppose, the broader issue of care taking a more equal role, because, as you say, the burden of care, both in terms of children and then older family members, tends to fall on the woman in the household, so that we take a more holistic approach to care. Certainly, we would like to see something along the Swedish model, that if this leave was transferred, that it would have to be used, because I suppose all the literature shows that what's in the best interest of the child is being in the care of its parents in the first year of its life. But certainly it's something in principle in order to support women, especially self-employed women and their families, and also in order to support those families to care for their child as they would like. It's
yeah, and I think, the thinking behind it, because I should say that myself and Deputy Fiona Loughlin, we drafted that bill, so it's of particular interest to myself, but we have an issue there where women that are self-employed, running their own business in public life, dad gets 2 weeks, and then very straight away you're thinking, who's going to mind the baby, because I have to get back and open my shop or open my accountancy practice or whatever it might be. And it seems like an undue burden. It seems silly, because there's leave there, but we've just somehow decided that only one parent can take it and the other person can't. And straight away you're faced with paying for very expensive childcare, as Sean has rightly pointed out. Many of those facilities will not take a child of that age. So why do we heap this extra pressure? And I think we're all in agreement of wanting to increase leave overall and share the caring responsibilities. But to be fair to new fathers, we only give them 2 weeks. We don't allow them to take any more. So how can we have that culture change and that shift in mentality if we don't have anything for people to actually change to? So, I welcome your comments, Michelle, that in principle you support the idea. I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting we take leave off mums. It's in situations where the leave isn't available to her anyways. Then wouldn't it be better for mum, dad and child to use existing entitlements, no extra cost to the exchequer, whilst we work on, in the short, medium and long term, in increasing the leave overall?
And just to finish on this, it would address the broader issue raised there of care being not just not being so gender focused, that the issue of care takes a broader perspective, and the role that fathers play is acknowledged
and vital. Yeah.
Absolutely. Unsurprisingly, the Scandinavians are well ahead of us on this, and Germany as well, and the results from there have shown that, and they're at this for 20 years. The more even the split in leave between fathers and mothers, the more beneficial it is for the children in the long term from educational perspectives, and also it gets fathers in the habit, as Tom will tell you, of playing an active role in parenting.
What is the joint responsibility?
Yeah, it has long-term benefits for women as well, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I was just going to say the NER are actually doing an econometric study on gender pay gaps and obviously childcare costs, and the impact of policies is part of that. So hopefully we'll have that research out by the end of this year or early next year, looking at the specific reasons for gender pay gaps. It's just a related point. In terms of your point about sharing, I completely agree, and I would echo what Social Justice Ireland have said. And one of the things that's really stark in the Irish data, obviously we all know about the costs, but in terms of female labour force participation, Ireland just trails so badly behind Nordic and other Northern and Western European economies. And what we do effectively is we cut off women's careers while they're in their prime. That leads to gender pay gaps. It also leads to lower labour force participation. It leads to lower levels of confidence. And in the long run, having a fairer burden, if burden is the word, is obviously a progressive policy, but in the long run would, in our view, lead to higher employment rates across the economy. And indeed, some of these investments in childcare should be considered, not making some of these investments in childcare should be considered as false economies, because what they do is they take people out of the economy, which means lower tax receipts and lower spending in the economy. There is, of course, the issue about affordability and quality of childcare as well. I know these are not directly related to the point that you're making, but it's a point the NRI made a couple of years ago as well, and so did Social Justice Ireland, that I talked earlier about an economy being able to grow 4.5% a year, but actually, in fact, you can change that up and down, and you can change it up and down with policies. So a policy that increases the labour force participation and employment rates pushes that up, so it allows you to have a permanently higher level of public spending. So there are macroeconomic issues for this as well.
It seems like an obvious thing to do is to remove a barrier. And just as part of your research into the gender pay gap, you might, and you probably already are, but take, for example, if you have a 30-year-old woman and a 30-year-old man attending for interview for a job, in the back of the mind of the employer is that she's likely to take 6 months off. He's not.
Yeah.
And straight away, the minute you share that leave, the minute you, I'm making an important point, Chairman.
But
the minute you share that leave,
you still are into your last minute, Deputy.
Well, thank you for shouting over my last minute, Chairman, for the second day running.
You're not. I don't take your time out at the time I talk, so you still have that minute. So.
Well, thank you again for interrupting my trail of thought and my point for the second day running. The point I was trying to make is that straight away you remove that as a consideration for the employer. You break that glass ceiling, you address the gender pay gap, and you level the playing field. So I'd ask you to make that part of your research.
Absolutely.
That the childcare, the burden is the wrong word, but the responsibility and the maternity requirement, the leave, is a factor.
And there is another economic point about that as well. If the second best candidate gets the job as opposed to the best candidate, then that is bad for the economy and society as well. So removing those biases from the job search and job seeking process and job hiring process is also good for the economy in the long run as well.
Thank you. Sorry, Ger, I saw you indicate there that you wanted to come in at some point in that.
Well, sorry, just in relation to childcare, just to echo the point that the more fathers are involved in the early months of looking after the child, I think all of the studies, all of the research indicates that the more that they do this in subsequent years, and that it's better, it's in the best interest of the child. So we would also kind of address this issue in the context of the new work-life balance directive that we have to transpose by 2022. I think there's a lot of very, very good provisions in there in relation to leave, in relation to care. there's a lot of things that are left open for Ireland to decide whether we want to go down this route, so I think this is something we'll have to look at over the next number of years. Just in relation to childcare, can I just pick up on the country-specific recommendations that came out on the 5th of June, the draft country-specific recommendations, just in relation to CSR2, just a point that we just wanted to flag up. The Commission is recommending that Ireland increase access to affordable and quality childcare. Now, we welcome this in principle, but we would just say that compared to last year's recommendation, they talked about increasing access to affordable quality childcare. This year, they've put in affordable and quality childcare, just to make the point that affordable childcare may not be quality childcare. It might be pedantic, but these things matter. So we believe it would have been preferable if the Commission had stayed with last year's recommendation to implement affordable quality childcare. And in relation to childcare, I think we have to acknowledge the issue that one of the big problems we face is the low paying conditions of workers in the sector. You spend years acquiring the qualifications to work in this sector. You get there, you're still on just above the minimum wage. I think the going rate is about €10.50 an hour. I mean, nobody who has spent all of this time was going to stay on that rate. So it's an issue. We will not get the kind of the quality childcare service that children deserve unless we address the issue of paying conditions. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, the next deputy I have indicating is Deputy Burton. Just before I go to you, Deputy Burton, I'm just going to take the opportunity, which I do regularly as Chair, just to say to all members, for the fairness to all members, we have a 5-minute questioning period, just to remind people, any time that somebody is answering you that does not come out of your 5 minutes, and there's no restriction in the amount of speaking time for members, because we will go back to all members to allow for additional periods of time. With 1 minute to go, I indicate to members that they're entering that last minute. So, Deputy Burton, if you would like to.
Thank you, Chairman. There's just a couple of issues, some of which have been referenced before, that I'd like to raise. The Taoiseach was on Taoiseach's questions there just before this meeting began, and he was extremely bullish about the desirability of tax cuts, particularly to middle and upper income people, and also then of moving the point at which people enter the higher rate of tax. Now, we did have tax cuts last year, so I really want to, ask the representatives of both organisations, do you actually think we have room for tax cuts, and particularly in the context of the recent advices of the Fiscal Advisory Council? Could you maybe just give your thoughts on that at this point this year? He really was quite emphatic about the desirability of tax cuts. So I'd just like to know your views. And secondly, then related, I was very glad to see the Social Justice Ireland's reference to a minimum effective tax rate, which I've long been an advocate of. And also I have a private members bill, which for more than a year now, well over nearly 2 years, about having effectively a standing commission on taxation, which would actually look in a coherent way on a continuous year-by-year basis at the issues of tax expenditures. And while this committee has done a lot of work, this would be to look at it in a broader way, and also to see who gains from certain kinds of tax structures and who are the losers from certain kinds of tax structures. I wanted to ask you as well, you referenced there, I think in terms of financial institutions in Ireland, I can absolutely be no argument against a minimum effective tax rate of, say, half the corporation tax rate, which would be roughly somewhere around 6%. One could move to that over a period of time, over maybe 2 years, because without a doubt our EU partners are changing their approach, and I think we are going to have to change their approach, or they may pick a rate of 12.5% or 15%, and we will have no autonomy unless we actually begin to make policy that indicates we have a position on this ourselves. There was a reference as well there to the trade-off on the bank levy. And certainly when we were in government, the bank levy was our proposal in order to mitigate the impact of the kind of zero tax companies. But I just wonder where you think that is now, and in terms of the international organisations that you would have contact with, what kind of progress you think has been made. The related thing I want to ask you about, because we're all interested in pay rates, is the government is clearly softening public opinion up to lift the cap on bankers' pay, on top bankers' pay, which runs around $500,000 plus some additional elements relating to pensions. Again, on a comparative basis, do you think now is the appropriate time to lift that levy on bank pay? Because there is a great deal of lobbying in financial services happening to have it. And I was just wondering where you stand on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Sean, if you'd like to...
Let me start off, and then I'll hand over to Eamon just to do some specifics as well. There's a couple of things. Your Standing Commission on Taxation, we think that's a very good idea. The tax changes and the impacts of tax expenditures and so on need to be kept under constant review. They need to be done. That needs to be done professionally, in the sense of like people with real expertise doing it on an ongoing basis, not on a one-off basis. The minimum effective corporate tax rate Eamon talked about earlier, we think this is critically important. We suggest to 6%, given Ireland's 12.5 rate, that the minimum effective corporate tax rate should be 6. I think as we move along, I think this seems to be on the agenda of the OECD now, and quite an amount of publicity about that in recent times. So I think that's not bad. Obviously, we hear a lot of reaction, negative, coming from some sectors in Ireland, but we think that there needs to be a fundamental overhaul, totally internationally, not just in Ireland, of the whole corporate tax approach to corporate taxation, and minimum effective corporate tax rates are part of that solution. The third thing about that you asked about there at the end was the maximum top bankers' pay. We would find it very hard to kind of go along with the idea that a banker doesn't have enough income when he or she is receiving, mostly he, I suppose, but not always, is receiving $500,000 a year. When you're talking about a situation where people have a minimum, the minimum wage is less than €10 an hour, and where we have poverty at 15%, and where there's 250,000 children living in poverty. So I think, like, priority-wise, increasing bankers' pay at the top end would not be a priority for us. Okay. There's two other things. There's the overall issue of should the money that's available, and there will be money available, be allocated for tax cuts rather than other issues. Our preference is that it be invested in infrastructure, in areas like social housing, water, public transport, and broadband, and then it should also, part of it should also go, the available amounts should go to improving our services in healthcare and education, and in addressing issues like childcare that Deputy Chambers raised earlier on, okay, and other issues that we have talked about. So our preference would be to move in that direction rather than be giving tax cuts. However, there's a couple of things about tax cuts if you're going to insist on doing it. At the income tax level, there's a simple, we have on page 7 of our budget choices produced a study, the results of a study, which show you, I think, 7 different options about what you could do in terms of the income tax and the USC. And it's very interesting what you find there. Only 2 of the options would actually turn out to be fair. all other 5 would benefit better off more than they would be low to middle income. The 2 that would benefit, that would be fair in the sense that they would spread the benefit fairly across all. One would be increasing the personal tax credit, not the band. Increasing the band is not an effective way of being fair. And the second, so increasing the personal tax credit, and the second one was a combination reducing the 0.5% and the 2% USC rates. And the results of all that are spelled out on page 7. We can provide more detail, obviously, if people are interested. But there's a broader question, maybe, that Eamon, my colleague Eamon Murphy, might like to take up. Okay.
I suppose, thanks, Sean. Sean has actually covered most of what I wanted to say in relation to that by through the focus on the credits. But yeah, whereas our preference would be for available resources to be used for investment in improving social infrastructure, public services, we understand that there is occasionally political pressure to bring in income tax cuts. Unfortunately, most of the proposals that we've heard from the current government have been targeted at people who would be on above average wages or significantly higher than that. Part of the reason for moving from a system of tax allowances to tax credits almost 20 years ago was to create a system whereby the government would have the mechanism to bring in fairer tax cuts, in other words, kind of across the board, so that everybody who received it would receive it at roughly the same amount. That's why we believe that any decreases, any cuts to income tax should be done through the tax credit system, not tinkering with bands and rates, which typically only benefit people on higher incomes. And that requires a need for bringing in a system of refundable tax credits. At the moment, there is, and it's disappointing actually that I don't have a screen behind me like I normally do when I'm talking about this, but I'll be able to show you a table from our analysis of last year's budget that showed the effects of the welfare and tax changes on people of different incomes. And what you'll see is a very interesting trough effect, whereby people earning between roughly 15 and 20,000 euros received almost no benefit whatsoever in the last budget. The reason for that is that without refundable income tax credits, the government doesn't have a mechanism by which they can target them. So bringing in that system of refundable tax credits would mean that everybody would benefit from a change in tax credits regardless of their income, as opposed to the situation now where people below 16,000 euros, 17,000 euros aren't benefiting at all, or very little.
Thank you very much. If you want to come in, if there's something specific extra, I just want to make everyone aware we have 2 full sessions today. The second session was due to start at 3:30, so we have a couple more deputies still indicating for this one. So just if we can keep it tight on all sides. Sorry, Tom, you wanted to?
I did. I suppose the first thing to say is when you have an economy that is potentially on the verge of overheating, the economic literature would suggest that the last thing you would do is cut taxes at that point, because all that does is stimulate it even more. So in any event other than an absolutely disastrous Brexit, you wouldn't consider tax cuts of any kind under those circumstances. The implicit tax rate, which is the amount of tax revenue over the actual tax base on labour, is higher in the European Union average than it is in Ireland. It's 36.1% there, it's 32.7% here. So you would have to increase labour taxes, which includes PRSI, by about 10% just to get up to the EU average. In terms of the point of the higher rate, well, what actually matters is the effective rate and the amount of tax you actually pay. A single earner, or indeed a one earner couple, 2 children on the average wage, pay much lower amounts of tax in Ireland than they do in peer countries, again, the Northern and Western European countries that we talked about. And one of the reasons for that is because you have to pay for so many things in Ireland, such as childcare, healthcare in some cases when it's private and so on. But it's not good policy in the long run, and the consequences of our lower levels of taxation. And my colleague and myself looked at per capita revenue in Ireland relative to the other rich countries of Europe, and we were the second lowest in aggregate receipts, and the per capita gap was €1,256 less revenue per person, which implied a scale gap of 6 billion over the economy. So the idea that we're overtaxed is just factually incorrect. People think that they're overtaxed because things are more expensive in Ireland. So we have a cost of living crisis. our problem, not an overtaxation problem. And as it turns out, most of the difference is on the employer-peer side, which brings you to issues about social wage. But the consequence of all this is, in 2018, again looking at those 10 countries, United Kingdom, France, Germany and so on, our per capita spending, excluding interest, was 15,791 per person. And that was the second lowest of all those countries, and you would have to increase public spending by 10% just to get up to the average. So, no, I don't think this is the right time to cut taxes. On a minimum effective tax rates, I promise I'll be very, very quick. There is a social contract. Everyone should pay a minimum effective tax rate. The difficulty in getting minimum effective tax rates for corporations is because they're not consolidated in terms of tax law in the way an individual is. And until we have a common consolidated corporate tax base across the EU, for example, it'll be very, very difficult to even establish what that effective rate would be, because what is the company when it has all of these subsidiaries? You might pay a very low effective rate in Ireland, it might be higher in a different country. Obviously, what they're doing is they're engaging in tax games to minimise the burden overall, and the point of a consolidated base is to deal with that. And very, very briefly, no, I don't believe the optics on the political landscape would be at all positive from removing pay caps for bankers.
Thank you. Are you okay, Deputy Burton? You
Yeah,
have about a minute left, so you're more than welcome to use it.
There's just an additional point I want to raise. I would say that at the moment in Dublin and in Ireland generally, land speculation is back where it was about 20 years ago. And I just wanted to ask the advice of our visitors. Ireland has always failed to, if you like, dampen speculation in building land. In terms of an affordable three-bedroomed house anywhere in the Dublin region at the moment, the land cost per unit has probably now gone past 60,000, and in some cases, in more desirable areas, I reckon it's up on around 100,000 per plot, which is why in many areas, including in my own constituency, you're seeing quite well-finished A-rated houses, but they're not terribly big. And essentially the cheapest of them, and I think a lot of the deputies will have the same experience, is about 450,000, but a lot of them are 550 to 600,000. And I mean, the crisis for a lot of people is these are what are affordable, never mind, the issue in relation to social housing. So I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on how we could try and, if you like, limit or prevent the spectre of this massive return to land speculation? And I don't know, again, in terms of the climate change documentation. This is my last point.
Thank you.
The thing that I was most disappointed about was that I do think there has to be a fairly exact quid pro quo to anyone that Eamon was referring to earlier as being in a lower income threshold in terms of fuel poverty, that if in fact the carbon tax comes in, that will be offset by corresponding increase, certainly for people, and I'm finishing on this sentence, that will be offset by a corresponding increase in fuel allowances to compensate.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you if you can just give very brief replies to that second part of the last two questions, because we have two more deputies I want to get to have an opportunity to answer in full. So, Tom, if you want to start first this time round, because we've started with Sean for a few times.
Being very, very brief, it's certainly our position that any increase in the carbon tax is conditional upon an offsetting hypothecated fund which would provide a dividend to every citizen, not every citizen, every person living in Ireland. And if constructed properly, that would lead to a situation where there would be a cash benefit to the bottom 50% of the population from an income distribution point of view. And our view is that a carbon tax increase should be conditional upon that happening.
Okay, thank you. Sean.
The land speculation issue, first of all. We've a long track record of trying to get this issue dealt with. Before the last land speculation, not to mind this current one, we were advocating an approach that would go back to reports that and a variation on stuff that had been talked about back in the 70s, and that was the idea that before a mechanism for kind of getting control of the costs involved would be that before rezoning, that the rezoning of land could only be done on land that was already owned by the council, local authority. In other words, that they would buy the land and they would have a top-up profit margin, okay, for the person that had purchased it. But then it was in the ownership of the local authority, and then they would be able to rezone it, and it wouldn't mean a windfall profit going to that person. We have other ideas about it, but basically it is a critical issue that needs to be addressed. The second issue on the carbon tax, Michelle will say a word.
Particularly just in relation to households and energy poverty, obviously if you're going to increase the carbon tax, you have to look at how you support those households. So not only do you have to support them financially, in the longer term you have to look at how you're going to move those households out of energy poverty, so you need to retrofit their homes so they have the option to be able to choose more energy efficient options into the future. So a payment is critical, but beyond the payment, it's what you do to get us all to reduce our emissions and how you target those households in particular and make sure those houses are retrofitted, they're energy efficient, and so you move them out of energy poverty for the longer term.
Okay, thank you very much. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Just on that point, very quickly, I mean, Tom said recycling to ensure the lowest households don't suffer from the carbon tax or indeed see some benefit. It should be a precondition. Would you also say your point should be a precondition, i.e. that people's homes should be retrofitted so that before there's any question of additional fuel costs, that the mechanism is made available and the resources provided to achieve it, to ensure that they don't suffer as a consequence? Because obviously the fear people have, I certainly have it, is that the carbon tax will go up, and the government are openly talking about it going up. But the person who's in, you know, an old council house that's, you know, got poor insulation, got damp, as is the case in a huge amount of social housing, will be hit with this, but it'll be years before there's a retrofit programme. So do you think, because I certainly do, as an absolute minimum, that it should be conditional? Any hit that people might take in that regard cannot happen prior to the retrofitting of their homes so that they have the opportunity to reduce their energy costs. So that's just one question. Will I do a question by question, or?
Whichever way you want.
Other question. Something that I think is never talked about. I know you all think about it and are conscious of it, but it's never a kind of objective of budgets. And that is to, although interestingly, an exit poll in the recent elections said, I think something like 90% or 85% of people thought the gap between the haves and the have-nots should be reduced, right? Overwhelming majority. It's never an objective in budgets that we say one of our objectives is to narrow the gap between the rich and poor. And we're going to look at how we're going to do that. Although it's beginning to be a debate everywhere, even in the United States, interestingly, right? They're starting to debate this because the gap between rich and poor is growing everywhere. Even when there's economic growth and the slight improvements in people's incomes, the gap is growing and growing. So do you think that should be a budgetary objective, right? And if it is, what should be done to actually begin to redistribute wealth? I mean, I see mention of wealth taxes. If I don't mind, I don't know who put them forward, and I very much welcome it, but they're quite modest. I mean, 1% on assets over $1 million. You know, those assets are probably accumulating additional value at about 3 or 4%, right? In reality, should we not be more radical and ambitious in trying to have wealth taxes that will redistribute wealth? The other thing, just on childcare. just a very, very specific question. I was at a Spark a briefing earlier on, and they were pointing out that the National Child Care Scheme, one of the impacts of it is because they're going to do away with other targeted supports for vulnerable parents who get some support for childcare at the moment through CETS schemes and CSS schemes, that they're actually going to lose dramatically because of the National Childcare Scheme, because the targeted supports for them are going to go in favour of the universal scheme. And I just wonder, are you aware of that, and have you any comments on it? And then, yep. Last point, just about, there's a general acceptance that I think there is, that our over-reliance on FDI and a small number of multinationals is a vulnerability, right? And the capital and the corporate tax receipts coming from them. So, how do I want to put this? How do you think we can diversify away from that? And into what should we be diversifying? And, to use one example, our committee has said we should look at the R&D tax credit, right? 700 million and rising, largely going to a small number of multinationals. I mean, if we're going to diversify, don't we need to dramatically reduce that and redirect those R&D funds towards the sort of areas that would give us a more sustainable economy? Into areas like public education, public research and development, and other strategic areas of the economy that would be more sustainable. And have you any comments on that?
Bang on the 5, by the way.
There you go.
Could I ask you to be brief in your answers, but just please cover, if you could, all the questions there. We'll start with Tom. Kieran has a hand there. We'll come over to you then for the...
I'll just cover what you're saying there about the carbon tax. Of course, as we said earlier, if it is designed right, then there should be a net gain for the bottom household. So if every man, woman and child in the country gets the same dividend, I think it was the SRI report there a couple of weeks back said the average house in the bottom 10% is probably likely looking at a €2 increase a week in their consumption bundle or whatever, and it's about €3 for the next decile. So not huge. I know it's still people are living on the margins, of course, and obviously there is some issue there if that comes in the form of a cheque at Christmas or something like that. Although that might also be something people will buy into. But of course, yes, the carbon tax won't work unless there are viable alternatives, and it'll be a function of resources and political will. Any retrofit program that's ramped up or successful in any way, we've had very little really. I mean, in terms of even targets or hitting targets that have been set up yet. So there's other ways as well that we could, in as part of a wider investment package, to reduce the impact on low to middle income families, and that would be public transport would be one of the big things, and to seriously ramp up investment there and have viable options for families who are probably have to have a car but can't afford it, or people in that space. So the carbon tax by itself won't bring about the change that we need to bring about to hit our targets, but also avert the climate catastrophe.
Okay, thank you, Kieran. Tom, you wanted to just add something to that? Was there a short? Are you
yeah, absolutely. There were 4 questions there. Just in terms of the last question, which was in relation to the broader point about it, changing industrial strategies, enterprise strategies. How does one move away from the current model, if indeed that model is under threat, and even if it's desirable? Well, I mean, one of the consistent things that we've pointed out over recent years is just how low the level of per capita public spending on R&D is in Ireland compared to peer countries. So, for example, in 2017, Sweden spent €461 per person. We spent 190. So Denmark spent 544, a third of what they spend in Denmark. So we need to develop a proper innovation system, including the universities and government, along with enterprises, high potential startups spinning out. We're not investing in R&D. We're not investing in the innovation economy. We need to do that, and that is fundamental to the type of strategy you're talking about, as well as areas such as education and building up what we call human capital. I completely agree in that. In terms of the equality budgeting, which is what we sometimes call it, in terms of reducing the gaps between the top and the bottom, there's always a focus on income. The greater inequality is actually with regard to wealth. So that's things like property taxes, wealth taxes. But the most effective taxation that we have in that regard is actually inheritance and gift tax, capital acquisitions tax, which is riddled with tax reliefs in Ireland. There's 90% reliefs for all sorts of assets, business, agriculture, and so on. And the ultimate yield ends up being between 400 and 500 million. So a vast amount of wealth essentially goes to the next generation without any taxation. So if you're a nurse or you're a construction worker, you could be paying a marginal rate of almost 50%. If you're sitting at home and inheriting money, you get it for free. That's clearly inequitable. And the studies show internationally that most assets are inherited. So actually what's happening is it's going through the generations and it's unearned. The definition of passive earnings. So inheritance tax.
To be very brief because I want everybody else to come in on this. So I'm going to.
I'll stop then.
Ger, you wanted to say something very.
Just in response. I mean, you raised the issue of inequality. I suppose. I'm just thinking of the OECD job strategy that came out last December. They spent 2 years looking at labour market performance in terms of employment rates, inequality, productivity, what policies produce the best labour market outcomes. And one of the things they concluded is that good collective bargaining. They found that the countries that are best in terms of employment rates, and Tom mentioned them here, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Austria, they have collective bargaining systems that work very, very well. One of their principal recommendations is that all countries, including Ireland, should put in place legal frameworks that support social dialogue and collective bargaining. I'm looking here at the European Commission's Innovation Scoreboard that came out last Friday. The countries that are at the very top of this list are Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Netherlands. The big difference that they have compared to Ireland is that they have proper systems of social dialogue and collective bargaining. So it's one of the issues that it's the best issue for tackling the issue of income inequality.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, I saw you indicating at the start there, do you want to come in on one of the answers?
To respond to the issue in terms of carbon tax, I mean, the challenge is the focus is on carbon tax. It should be on carbon policy. Carbon tax is one element of the policy. You can't retrofit homes overnight, so you're going to have to support people through the tax credit and welfare system whilst you're ramping up the retrofitting, and you need to target those households that are in energy poverty first. Just in relation to the childcare and the new national childcare scheme, I suppose care must be taken with the potential impacts on that, particularly as you were rolling all the supports into one and creating a universal system. Those families that were reliant on additional targeted supports, you have to make sure that those families don't lose out. So I think care will have to be taken when this is introduced in the coming months.
Thank you. Sean?
Absolutely. Reducing the gap between rich and poor should always be a focus or a priority in budgets, and it isn't always the case. For years we've been doing analysis of budgets. In the document we have supplied you with today, our budget choices document on page 4, we provide a worked out impact assessment of the last 3 budgets and the distribution of the gains. And it's quite clear that the people who have gained least are single unemployed people and those on lowest earnings. So there's obviously a serious problem. We would say that there are 2 kind of key things that need to be constantly kept in focus. One is the people who are depending on welfare. Their payments should be index linked at least to keep so that they don't lose out. And we show how that can be done and paid for in our document. And that would, if we were to bring to 27.5% of average industrial earnings, which is where our average earnings, which is our average incomes, which is where it should be benchmarked, it needs an increase in the coming budget of €9 a week for a single person. The second piece is the working poor, critical issue, over 100,000 people who are in jobs but still living in poverty. For them, the most effective targeted way of getting at those people and ensuring that that gap is reduced is to make income tax credits, the two main tax credits, refundable. And both of those issues could be done, and we've shown how they can be done within the document. There's one other piece on FDI that Eamon might deal with.
Eamon, I'm going to ask you to be really one sentence on it. I'm going to draw this section of this first session for us to a conclusion around 10 minutes from now, and I have 2 more deputies who still want to ask you questions. So if you could be very brief in your FDI.
Acknowledging the shortage of time, I will do it in one sentence, semicolon. Page 10, investment in rural Ireland, regional Ireland, and our proposals for how to support locally driven investment, SMEs, and build a platform whereby essentially not everybody has to move to Dublin in order to have a job.
A good sentence, a decent length sentence. Thank you very much, Deputy Broughan, you're up next.
Thanks, Carla. Well, just to follow on about carbon taxation, I mean, obviously, we're given huge attention the last number of months to our own committee in the House, its report, and now the Minister's Carbon Action Plan. And really, if you do go through it, I mean, you could see it to some extent as people asking us for like a total game changer. Not just in terms of, retrofitting or whatever, but all the changes like with transport, across food, across housing and so on, that you're asking for a very fundamental change. Now, the people I think I represent are very suspicious, I suppose, of the whole intent of this. Some of them, by the way, regard the Green Party, and I've always regarded them as a party of the right, not a party of the left anyway, for starters, and that it's a regressive policy. But very suspicious because they kind of feel, if you look at Tom's Neary's analysis and Ictu's analysis of past taxation, we know it's been very unfair. And we had consumption taxes, huge reliance on consumption. You could have said, for example, that our huge reliance on excise taxes, which again, the family car, etc., again discriminated grossly against working class households, lower income households. So I think there is a huge suspicion that we're being led by my constituency colleague, Deputy Breathnach, and others into a world, which we don't know where we're heading, and which in fact will be much more expensive, for ordinary citizens, and that the fair mitigation. People, in the report we talked about fair mitigation, but I mean, fair mitigation, will it be serious, or again, will it be the little people who carry the can? And that's the problem. We kind of feel. One proposal, for example, is this 5-year carbon budgets. Would there be merit, for example, in having a 5-year general budget then, so we know where we're going overall, or the next government when it comes in after the election, we know where we're going, say 5 years down the road, and we can look at all of the analysis. So I mean, I think that's one thing that comes through very, very strongly to us in the response. You might have seen, we pick it up, I think, on the media and at the doorstep and so on and so forth. And just a second point then, on the SCI's analysis, that gap that you have there in the tax take, and I think it was yourself, Father Sean, who first alerted the committee very strongly to the consistent underestimation of the health expenditure, of the health budget. And we know again in coming days, unfortunately, we're faced with this again, that we just are not prepared to put a significant enough expenditure into that area. So are you able, though, to show, like what we try and show, I suppose, in our parties and as individuals to the Minister for Finance, exactly what we want them to do? For example, last year, one of the things I advocated was equalising diesel and petrol, and picking up that, whatever, even over a few stages, 150 million here, 150 million there, or whatever. And for example, you say that those who are lucky enough, and I agree with you, to be earning over 100 grand, 125,000, and so on and so forth. Are you saying specifically? I know in your big report that we're going to go for a 45% rate or a higher rate, 48% or whatever, on those kind of lucky. That 300,000 is it tax units who have that kind of consistent income. So are you individually prepared to make the gap? And just a final point to everybody. We've been watching with interest on this side of the planet, I suppose, Jacinda Ardern and her government in New Zealand, talking about having a budget and an evaluation, economic evaluation, based on well-being. And we're talking about it again, to be fair to constituency colleague Deputy Bruton, when he was Minister of Education, he was pushing forward this idea of the well-being in our education system, across the whole system, the teachers, the pupils, especially the parents, that you'd have a sort of national well-being. So have any of you done any work in regard to this? What would be the extra kind of resources or expenditure if we really wanted to have, for example, that nobody would be homeless or whatever? Thanks, Carla.
Thank you. Sean, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, there's a few items there. The climate change plan. I'm not that convinced that it's a plan. There's a whole lot of different individual items in there, but there aren't timeframes, there aren't costings, and I think we're in danger of getting an outcome that you're pointing to, which is that vulnerable people will be the ones who carry the can, will be hit hardest, and that we won't actually have a genuine, focused, integrated plan that travels over, it affects everybody in the context of their capacity to contribute to it, and that it moves together. And that's what we need. Now, I think it's kind of critically important that we recognise that the pieces of this plan to be have to travel simultaneously. Michelle made this point earlier on in a slightly different context, but like if we're not prepared to ensure that vulnerable people, whether they are rural dwellers or people who are depending, who are in fuel poverty or whatever, all of these people have to be protected from the consequences of what we're talking about.
Thank you.
The consequences in that space.
I'm going to ask you if points have been made before in answering other deputies,
okay,
just to be very brief and move.
That's perfectly okay. That's perfectly okay. So what I'm saying is, like, there need to be all of the various things. The mitigation has to be in place if we're to move forward on the climate change plan. Otherwise, there's in real danger of the vulnerable being the victims. On the health budget overspend, like we were pointing out that for a number of years we've shown what the situation is there. Our concern, it has always been a situation in which maintaining the current level, the level of existing service has not been fully provided for in the following year's budget, and as a result it automatically goes over budget. There's a danger of that happening in other areas as well. I think it's critically important that should not be the way we go, and to make that not happen, we need to be transparent, and the numbers need to be on the table. That's the point I was making earlier on about some of the numbers that have been removed or omitted from the spring statement this year, that have been in the spring statements for several years previously. We need a transparent process that recognises numbers adjust as the year goes by, but that we have the numbers all the time and we can make those adjustments, and that we're not in a situation where people are kind of trying to work out the future, what should be in the budget, not being clear about the various components.
Just very, very quickly on New Zealand's wellbeing budget, you do need a framework for every budget. There needs to be a set goal on the type of society towards which you're moving. If New Zealand have a proposal for a wellbeing budget, that's great, but what we would recommend is what we've done in our document here, which is to tag each one of our policies with a sustainable goal, sustainable development goal, or SDG, to which that relates. And we believe that government, we've been saying it for a couple of years, that government should do the same with every line of the budget, with each piece of legislation they bring in, and we'd like to see it done at an EU level as well. The question for us would be, if the legislation or policy or budget measure you're bringing in isn't related to a particular sustainable development goal, then what does it relate to? Because basically all aspects of human well-being are covered, we believe, by those 17 SDGs.
Okay, I'm going to move up briefly. John, do you want to add anything to that? Or
there isn't much more to say, other than the fact that I agree with Deputy Broughan that environmental impacts, inequality impacts and economic impacts should be considered holistically as part of a budgetary process that isn't a big reveal in October, but that is constructed through a consultative process with stakeholders throughout the calendar month, and with time given for academics, researchers, Parliamentary Budgetary Office to actually do the analysis, the inequality analysis, the carbon analysis, and the economic analysis, and to feed all of that together, not just the Department of Finance, other departments too, and other stakeholders.
Thank you. I'm going to, because I did a slight miscalculation, there was actually 3 deputies, not 2 deputies. So Deputy Bailey, you're up next, and then Deputy Lahart to finish for this section.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions to fire to you around childcare, but just to broaden it out. Myself and Deputy Kate O'Connell brought a proposal forward about 18 months ago around tax credits for childcare. And I know that this isn't always popular, but the purpose for this was to give choice back to families, to give the ownership of this back to parents, and to reflect modern society where a lot of people don't work 9 to 5 anymore, and probably most of us in this room don't work 9 to 5 anymore, so the conventional commercial operator doesn't work for the majority of people. And we're still working away on that, but I would just like to hear what your views are on that. And for me, it's about giving ownership back to parents around quality childcare, what they deem is suitable for their own children in their own home or in another environment. But I would just be interested in your views on that. When it comes to affordable housing, we had a really good meeting yesterday with the NDFA around affordable housing and the complexities that are around that, which I'm very familiar with, and we are subsidising some of our cost rental models to the region of 40,000 and 80,000, depending where they are in Dublin, the cost of land, the topography and the complexities that go with that. And we talk a lot, you've mentioned a lot about Scandinavian countries here, but the Vienna model, and that seems to be the panacea to cost rental. That has been established for a very, very long time, and we're only at the pilot stage of that. And we're looking at ways of how we can bring down the cost of rent in this country, especially into the affordable sphere. In light of, and you weren't obviously privy to that meeting, I would imagine yesterday you might not have seen it. We're looking at rents of about €1,200 in one of our pilot schemes, and that is because of underground car parking, again hitting granite, other complexities that are on that site. And have you got any suggestions or ideas around affordable housing, affordable purchase, cost rental that we may not have seen or we may have seen before that you might want to remind us about? I'd appreciate that. In relation to the Help to Buy scheme, and almost 12,000 people have availed of this at this point, and I think it was subscribed far beyond that. And when you're dealing with the construction industry, what they need is certainty, consistency, and obviously we have a skills shortage in this area as well, and a lot of investment has to go into that area around apprenticeships, especially when we're looking at newer technologies in building. But the Help to Buy scheme is due to finish this year. Would it be prudent to actually, if it was to be extended, and I don't know if it will be, that would be announced prior to a budget so that construction industry can plan ahead in that sphere? I was glad to hear what Mr Murphy said around people not having to travel to Dublin for work, and I think Ireland 2040 being a statutory plan is all about investing in our cities, compact growth, and encouraging that opportunity of growth around employment and education in those areas so people don't have to travel to Dublin. I would agree with you about rebalancing the country. When it comes to costing of climate plan, we had a really good meeting yesterday in the Budgetary Oversight Committee, and it was highlighted that some of the costings weren't in the plan because some of them will be borne by the person themselves, whether they're buying an electric car or whether they're retrofitting their homes. And I'm just wondering, have you any ideas around the retrofitting of people's homes? Could it be done like the Help to Buy scheme? Could you get a tax rebate over a number of years? Is there models like that could be replicated? Thanks, Colm. When it comes to that, and the last thing I'll say is more of a point. Dunleary County Council in 2004, we started a very deep maintenance programme in our council stock, and Deputy Boy Barrett was on the council with me at the time. And so any money that we get back in the sale of any council properties goes back into the renovation of our council properties, and a number of deep retrofitting has been carried out, wraparounds, etc. Blah, blah, blah. So the Dunleary Council have been very proactive in this sphere for a long number of years and will continue to do so. And the standard of council houses that are being delivered now, these homes are A1, 2 or 3 rating, and visited one quite recently, Fitzgerald Park, over 50 units in Monkstown. And the standard of home being delivered is exceptional, but exceptional is expensive. And how do we rebalance that?
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now, I'm going to reverse again, so I'm going to start with Tom or Kieran or...
On the retrofit stuff, I mean, there's space there, especially in the Midlands, and the Irish Congress Trade Union produced a document with the help of Neary a couple of months back on possibly through Bord na Móna rolling out a trainee scheme and possibly an information campaign for the for homeowners, and not even homeowners, but residents of the Midlands first and foremost, and the Midlands, of course, being central, could develop capacity in that depressed region in this area, where there's also evidence of a huge amount of inactive ex-tradesmen and women who would have been affected by the financial crisis. So the kind of the jump is not so far to reskill some of these workers in Bord na Móna, perhaps, as well as this glut of inactive former workers. There's other way, and that could also roll out a state-led, state-funded scheme to do the entire social housing stock, public housing stock, including schools, etc., filling them up with solar panels, and having a scheme there also that they can sell energy back into the grid. These are things that have been talked about for a long time, but there hasn't been much movement on them. For then the next kind of group of households for a little bit further up the income scheme, there is, in other countries, I don't have it with me there, but examples of low interest loans from the state that could help, because there are grants available there as it is, and they're not being taken up, or at least not being taken up at a rate at which we're going to reach any of our targets. So there's low interest loans, and there's also front-ended by the state that might even just come off electricity bills over the course of 20 years, if we could get sign-up from some of the semi-states on that. So.
Tom, do you want to...
Yeah, no, on the affordable housing and cost rental, yeah, no, the reality is that while cost rental can lead to lower rents, it's going to be at the margin. It's not going to be transformatively different. But all of these policies, and particularly once if and once it is scaled up in terms of house building, that will eventually have a downward effect on rents across the board. But it will take time. It's not something that you would expect based upon a single pilot or something that would happen overnight. Unfortunately, this is going to be something that can only be resolved by a satisfactory and sufficient level of house building in the state, which is going to have to exceed long-term average demand for a number of years and reach a level of about 40,000 per year, at least for a sustained period of time. The expectation is that a lot of the job growth of the future will be in the Greater Dublin area, and that will lead to further population pressures and greater demand for housing there. And again, the cycle of high rents will continue. So there's no silver bullet there, unfortunately. Obviously, if there is a special purpose vehicle with sufficient scale to borrow at very, very cheap rates, that can also have a marginal effect on rents down the line. In terms of the issue of help to buy, again, I made the point earlier about tax expenditures and how they are rarely the optimal option in terms of public policy. They, in my view, merely act to stimulate demand. They won't, or at least there's a very high level of deadweight costs associated with them. So my view is that the scheme should be ended. But I do agree with you that certainly advanced signalling by the department and by the Minister should be given if that is in fact the decision. And this goes back to the point where the budgetary process should be beginning on January the 1st, if not the previous year, and signalling and decisions about these things should be made in the first half of the year rather than a big reveal in October.
I'm going to just wrap up there, time-wise. Sean, do you have anything you want to add? Or do you want to, Michelle, or
Michelle, the childcare?
Oh, very briefly on the childcare. In order to give choice back to families, I think the first thing we should focus on is expanding the availability but also the types of childcare that families can access. I think you need to do that first, invest in that, and then look at how you support families. And I suppose making the tax credit refundable would be important first to make sure the credit would reach every family. And then just to echo what Kieran said on the retrofitting, and we have a proposal looking at targeting social housing in particular based on a Dutch model which retrofitted at scale.
You raised two items on the thing, just a sentence or two on both. Yes, we have done a lot of work on cost rental. We've been doing it for a number of years. We did a presentation 2 or 3 years ago to the Dublin Economics Workshop down in Wexford on how this might actually work when it wasn't on anybody's agenda, I think. We have developed our proposals now, and I think I would be more optimistic about it having impact at scale if you go the route of setting up a special purpose vehicle that keeps the actual amounts of the budget accounts, and we have worked out how that could be done, involving agencies such as the European Investment Bank and the government and social housing organisations and various others. So there's a lot of work that we have done on that. We're quite happy to share that with you at any time. Second thing, Help to Buy scheme, should it be extended? If it's to be extended, it should not be extended, in our view, under any circumstance. It is basically contributing to the escalation of cost, increase in cost. We think very much that the focus needs to be on the provision of housing itself and on elements that will bring down the cost of housing rather than in subsidising the person who's trying to buy the house. If the person is being subsidised to buy the house, it will always result in the house going up by that amount of money. So what it involves is pushing up the price. We would be very negative about, we're negative about the proposal anyway, and we would be quite happy to see it end at the end of this year.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have evidence of that, Sean?
Yeah, we'd have a fair bit of stuff.
Because I haven't found it. I'd contradict you on that one, but I'd love to see the evidence that you have in that regard.
I'm quite happy to share the stuff we have with you.
I'm going to just ask for a pause on this because I want to let Deputy Lahart in to conclude the last of this session. We have another session to go, by the way. I would remind all deputies that we have another full session to follow this. Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. I'm looking forward to the following session as well. And thanks for your important advocacy. I think we have been used to what might be called conservative, small c. The conservative players have been before us. It's nice to get that counterbalance, and I mean that in a positive way in both regards. So we've had IFAC and we've had ESRI, etc. So it's nice to get a counterbalance. It's nice also to see the. Nice to see your views, which I know Deputy Boyd Barrett.
I'm going to enjoy that one, Deputy Lahart.
Deputy Boyd Barrett. Sorry. I'm interested from I suppose just from because we're at the Budgetary Oversight Committee, try to be objective, really. Certainly I do. So it's interesting, Deputy Boyd Barrett's a good colleague, but you support the carbon tax, he doesn't. You support the idea of a tax on wealth, including property, he doesn't. And I'd regard you as, most of you as kind of
John, what are you talking
tax
about?
on property, and I would regard you as kind of left of centre thinkers. Just in relation to the affordable housing piece, I mean, which do you think is better? And I'm not asking for a yes or no, but just to consider. We would always, myself and the Chair were the member of the same local authority for a number of years. So if you look at homeless HAP payment, okay, in South Dublin County, that can be up to €2,000 a month. Okay, so that's 24,000 a year. That's 48,000 in 2 years. Which is better, to invest that and the state take an equity in an affordable home, or for the state to pour that into the big black hole of rental? So it's just in response genuinely to what Sean was saying. So look, one of the things that I've looked out for here is the themes that emerge in advance of the budget. Now, I take Tom's point on board in relation to the budget transparency. It's frustrating for us as Budgetary Oversight Committee to hear the themes that come up in advance from the different players over the last 2 years, and then for the government, and every government does it, to find $1 billion or $500 million under the mattress the night before, and we've had no opportunity to scrutinise it. And we have tried to, I think we've tried to make that point to government that the budget process needs to be more transparent. So 2 themes seem to be emerging from you guys across there, which I'd be taking on board and watching out for. The IMF flagged it with us at an informal briefing about a month ago, and that's about demographics and the ageing population. It didn't feature in any of the briefings that we got last year. So climate change would have been corporation tax, carbon taxes, petrol and diesel equalisation. They were the issues last year. A number of them were fudged. VAT on tourism was dealt with. Every piece of advice we get in relation to spare money, windfall money, is to bank it. And IFAC were here last week reinforcing that, talking about a prudence fund in the event of a downturn. So it's completely contrary to what you're suggesting of, non-recurring capital expenditure. And this issue of a prudence account and this issue of stowing away some money, particularly from corporation tax, is it's like the irresistible force meeting the immovable object in one sense. I'm very convinced by that, and it's because it's come from so many informed players, and I would be surprised, I'm not preempting anything, but I'd be really surprised if it wasn't part of the Budgetary Oversight Committee's report to the Minister, because it's just, you're the first to kind of say, look, windfall should be kind of spent on something else. The other thing then is in demographics is the childhood education, and so they're 2 of the things that I'd be watching out for. I mean, I don't understand why, just generally in relation to education, the state, since the foundation of the state, has taken an arm's length approach to it. I don't know why the state hasn't got involved here in preschool education. There's great opportunity with the school building programme. I've said this for a number of years as a councillor as well as a TD, for preschool facilities to be co-located with primary school facilities. That would be exceptionally time-saving for parents, could provide after-school facilities on one site, and in terms of the quality that Father Sean spoke about, you could have a mixture of degree-trained primary school teachers who are therefore qualified to do preschool, but we don't do it. And okay, you could get a commercial enterprise in or private enterprise in to provide the education, but the state would own the buildings, because what I find in my own constituency, it's the cost of leasing and the cost of the repayments on the infrastructure that the preschools have bought, that is the biggest single contributing factor to the fees they charge. So they're my points. I'm not going to come back again. Appreciate what you're saying, and you might just respond to the few questions I asked there.
Thank you very much, Deputy. We'll start with Sean. Final starting point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deputy. The affordable, the housing issue and the HAP, we'd be much happier, and we've argued this endlessly, to see that money being invested rather than spent on HAP. We consider HAP to be basically almost out of control at this stage, but we're spending extraordinary levels of money that isn't basically producing the kinds of housing. We're still stuck with the housing problem at the end of the day. So we'd be much happier to see a move to have that invested in social and affordable housing and start moving in that direction. We would argue that the cost rental proposal that I talked about a minute ago would actually, this would help it along the way. Okay, on the spare money issue, do we sort of spend it or bank it? We actually make a provision in our budget costings for the rainy day fund. We think there should be a certain amount going aside. However, we also think that we should not repeat, as a country, kind of repeat the kinds of problems or the mistakes we made before. 10 years ago, we had an extraordinary crash, and we went a very tough austerity route in terms of dealing with it, as did much of the rest of the world. among most international economists of note today, there would be agreement that that was the wrong way to go. The critical issue that we should recognise is that we have serious deficits and that these deficits need to be addressed. And we get opportunities to do that. And there's two types of opportunities. One is the time after a crash. For example, suddenly you have a whole lot of people who were involved in construction and they're unemployed. It would have been quite easy to take a lot of those and actually proceed to deal with the gap that we had in social housing, for example, or affordable housing. Today, we have a situation where we have money that comes that's kind of windfall money. We have an opportunity to do something with that. Tom has pointed out already in Nevin Institute that the investment levels in Ireland are low by international standards. In fact, they've been extraordinary low. If you were to take the last decade, our investment numbers are very low. The state investment.
Yeah, but that's across Europe, though. I mean, we were at the European semester. I mean, it's 20%. It's dropped on average 20% in Europe since the crash because the states cannot afford it. So they are really reliant on the private sector.
Yeah, but like we did a study that showed that Ireland had the lowest level. This was a few years ago now. But but it's in the last decade, right? Ireland had the lowest level of investment of any government in the EU. But what frightened us wasn't so much that we were at that level, but that if we doubled our level of investment, we'd still be the lowest. Now, that shows you the kind of thing over a decade, how far we've fallen behind. We're closing some of that, absolutely. There's been I'm not denying the investment that's happening now. But what I'm saying is there are huge gaps that in infrastructure particularly that are one-off in the context of expenditure to be addressed. We have an opportunity to do it, and we should use the opportunity. The opportunity being a windfall income that comes, we'll say, in the corporation context or whatever, rather than putting that away. And the danger, what we're likely to wind up with is that if there's another crash, hopefully there won't be, but if there were, we'd wind up repeating the same problem, that we'd be likely to spend all of that money rescuing vultures rather than protecting vulnerable people.
Thank you. I'm going to either ask Ger, Tom, or Kieran to make a final concluding set of remarks. You can't, Richard. I honestly, I'm 25 minutes over when I actually said we'd stop. So we're that thing. So, gentlemen, can you just do?
Well, sorry, just to echo Sean's point on HAP and investment in social and affordable housing, just to pick up the point where we acknowledge in the draft country-specific recommendations that came out on the 5th of June, the Commission for the first time, as far as we're aware, raised the issue of inadequate cost rental in Ireland. We think this is something that could be, in their country report, they talked about, housing, the need for further investment in housing. We think there could be areas here where this is something that, say, at European level could be prioritised over the next multi-annual financial framework. So I'll just leave it on that point. But if you want
Thank you. Unless you have something to add, or very briefly.
No, I think I'm happy with that.
Okay.
I agree that.
How long, Richard, is the
Short
sorry,
question.
Deputy Barrett. Sorry, very quick.
Do you honestly, as you implied just earlier, think that if we ramped up housing supply per se, right, over, I think you said 40,000 units a year, that house prices would actually fall?
Okay, I'm going to ask you to give a yes or no answer to the Deputy on that.
It depends on the context.
That's most definitely not yes or no.
So
very quickly, answer.
It depends on the context for demand and supply in the market at the time. So how many extra people are being employed year on year? Does the supply and the demand, it'll also depend on where in the country. So if you're increasing house,
okay, it's a bigger answer.
But in general, all things being equal, I would expect house prices to go down in that context, compared to the amount of production we have at the moment.
Can I say thank you very much, Tom, for that very short. Can I thank you all for coming in? Can I thank you all for the really interesting and informative exchange of ideas which we've had here. We'll apologise to the people waiting for the last hour outside the door when they get into us. It has been, I think, a really good session. I'd like to thank you very much. We are going to conclude this first session here now. My thank you to Eamon Murphy, to Sean Healy, to Michelle Murphy, Ger Gibbons, Tom MacDonald and Kieran Nugent for all your contributions. We will now stand adjourned for 5 minutes. That's great. We will now resume into public session. Okay, thanks. We are now in public session, so I would like to begin the second part of our meeting today. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome to our meeting various people and to apologise to them for the overrun in our first session. So we do appreciate you waiting and the apologies again for the delay. So from my back, we've Fergal O'Brien, accompanied by Jared Brady. On the Construction Industry Federation, we've Pat Lucy, accompanied by Tom Parlin and Jeanette Mayer. And thank you for making yourselves available to us. As this is part of our pre-budget consultation process, we obviously have a number of key stakeholders we've invited in to engage in a discussion with us, and we'll be doing this now, and also we'll be doing some more of it in September. Before I begin to ask you to make your opening statements, I'd like to just go through the normal privilege notice, which is to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded also of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or by an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So with that done, I will go straight away to ask you, Mr. O'Brien, if you could make your opening statement to us. We had tried to keep a time limit of approximately 6 minutes on these, so appreciate that. So I'll hand over to you now for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much for the committee for the invitation to join you this afternoon. As you know, IBEC is the country's main business representative organisation. Our members employ 70% of the private sector workforce. Within IBEC, we represent 40 different sectors of the economy. So as you can imagine, there's a broad range of issues on which members will be concerned in advance of Budget 2020. However, we're seeing, I suppose, an increasing coalescing, probably around 4 issues, which I'm going to speak to briefly over the course of my opening remarks. The first of these, and by far the most important, are the challenges that we see now for the Irish economy as a result of very significant global tax reform. The second and connected one relates to how we now urgently need to broaden our enterprise base and do much more to support entrepreneurship and the SME sector more generally in the economy. Thirdly, what we see is the urgent need for delivery of much needed infrastructure and housing to address quality of life concerns. And finally, I think we couldn't have this session without speaking about the ongoing challenges of Brexit and the mitigation measures that we need to see from a business perspective in Budget 2020. To start with the issue of international tax reform, we think that there is unprecedented change underway in the global tax environment. Recent developments, most noticeably the ongoing changes under the OECD and G20 base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS initiative, will have a major impact on how our foreign direct investment model evolves into the future. This is going to have significant implications for both industrial and fiscal and budgetary policy. We've recently seen the publication of the G20 BEPS programme of work for global tax reform. Those proposals, if they are implemented, and we think they will be, would represent the most significant and fundamental changes in global tax policy in a century. Some of the proposals, in particular those pursuing a minimum effective global corporate tax rate, will pose significant challenges for Ireland's FDI-based model. The decisions that we're going to make in the coming budgets will probably be the most important ones for Irish industrial policy for many decades. For the moment, our FDI-driven model and growth continues to deliver the resources that we can use to help Ireland transition to a new model. Cumulatively, over the past 4 years, we have taken in 14.3 billion in unexpected corporate tax revenue. So again, I'll just reiterate here, that is the scale of the corporation tax surprise in the space of 4 years, 14.3 billion. We believe that the significance of this issue is widely underappreciated in Irish public policy debate. The significant resources and investment that this trend has brought and continues to bring to the country is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to prepare us for a future when, ironically, other parts of our business investment toolkit will become relatively much more important. Managed well, we could use these very significant resources to ensure sustainable growth in Ireland's business substance, matched by improved public infrastructure, a thriving indigenous sector and improved standard of living for Irish households. However, thus far, we've used the vast majority of the €14.3 billion corporate tax surprise to fund unplanned and unbudgeted supplementary estimates, and we believe that this trend now has to stop. Starting in Budget 2020, we will have no choice but to follow through on the promises of previous decades and finally make a much more concrete effort to grow our Indigenous enterprise base. This should include an intense focus on productivity, innovation, skills and helping companies to export early. The prospect of a no-deal Brexit adds significant urgency to this need and must provide a moment of clarity for all policymakers. We must make Ireland a much more attractive country in which to start and grow a business, and we must ensure that our enterprise base in the future is much more balanced than it is at present. In relation to infrastructure delivery, Ireland has a long history of focusing cuts on productive spending during any downturn. We now have an opportunity to break that cycle and to deliver significantly improved quality of life into the future. We strongly believe that any additional unexpected windfall corporate tax revenues over the future years should be set aside into a designated strategic investment fund. This should be done and used then to guarantee the funding of capital projects in the new National Development Plan, other key areas of our national innovation infrastructure, and to bring much needed funding to our currently cash-starved third-level education sector. It is imperative that the planned capital projects in the EP are delivered as quickly as possible and that they don't fall victim to either administrative or process responses to the recent high-profile project overspend concerns or to the reprofiling of capital spending. Finally, in relation to the challenges of Brexit, it is clear that these risks for the Irish economy and for Irish business have not gone away. Many IBEC members spent millions preparing for March and April Brexit dates, which did not happen, and they have incurred significant and many unnecessary business costs. We continue to hope that the withdrawal agreement will be finalised and that an orderly Brexit can be achieved. However, business must also plan for the worst and needs to continue making preparations for every scenario. But government must also do much more in order to provide clarity on meaningful mitigation and support measures that would be implemented in order to preserve jobs and enterprise in the event of a disorderly Brexit. These measures must be timely and they must be substantive. In summary, business believes that Budget 2020 is one of the most important in recent times. It must respond to the exceptional nature of corporate tax trends. We think that this issue for the Irish economy is probably actually more important than the risks of Brexit. And I think we might come back to that further over the course of our conversation. We want to see this budget provide much stronger discipline in relation to current spending, to help broaden the enterprise base and deliver much needed investment in infrastructure, housing, education, innovation, all of these which will help to preserve our future growth prospects and national prosperity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now I will ask for Mr. Lucy, if you could make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairperson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. The issues we're here to discuss will be covered in our budget submission, which is in draft currently. I will refer to it throughout this statement. The construction industry underpins the competitiveness and productivity of the domestic economy. Therefore, ensuring Ireland has a dynamic construction industry with the capacity to deliver efficiently and cost-effectively is critical. Where the policy and regulatory environment has made construction financially viable, the industry has responded, delivering high-quality construction for private and public sector clients. The large increase in student accommodation over the past 5 years and the ongoing high growth levels in commercial property are examples. In areas such as private residential outside the Greater Dublin area, or in social housing, securing finance is more challenging, and this has limited the industry's ability to deliver the required output. Getting the policy and regulatory environment right is critical. The National Development Plan, Project Ireland 2040, Rebuilding Ireland, social housing targets, the Action Plan for Jobs, the Regional and Rural Action Plan, the Apprenticeship Action Plan, the Deep Retrofit Programme and Ireland's Climate Action Strategy require a dynamic construction industry. And let me be frank, as it currently stands, without proactive measures from the Government, there isn't a chance of meeting these targets. The ambition in the €116 billion outlined in the National Development Plan, in developing Cork, Limerick, Galway, Sligo as an economic counterbalance to Dublin, and in delivering 35,000 homes per year, is being stifled by blockages, challenges and constraints on the industry to deliver these laudable aims. In the area of civil engineering, the objective is to deliver the infrastructure that connects regions, improves people's daily lives and enable house building. This sector of the industry has had 9 consecutive months of contraction in the Ulster Bank PMI survey. Quite simply, the commencement of NDP projects is out of sync with the declining state of the civil engineering industry. In delivering major infrastructure, the time between announcement, commencement and completion of works can be decades. The timeline for infrastructure projects is predictably uncertain. Yet, despite a huge, immediate economic and social demand for infrastructure and a commitment to invest, the relatively small spends on preparatory works are not prioritised. This will delay projects unnecessarily and ultimately cost the Exchequer as inflation erodes investment. After a decade of underinvestment, we welcome the Government's commitment to infrastructure in the National Development Plan. In normal times, this would provide companies with a clear and certain pipeline of work, giving the industry the confidence to invest in people, plant and technology. However, we are not in normal times. That confidence is not present as the civil engineering industry has never really recovered from the recession. Investment in key strategic projects should begin now to mitigate delays that will invariably occur. Collaboration at an early stage is the key to unlocking progress. The second key area for focus is housing. While significant progress has been made, our house building sector is reporting that a lack of infrastructure is limiting the development of much residentially zoned land. The CIF and its constituent association, the Irish Home Builders Association, is urging Government to increase the provision for the local Infrastructure Housing Activation Fund and simplify its implementation. This initiative has played a major role in opening up development lands for housing and playing its part in increasing housing output by 25% year on year for the past couple of years. What's needed now is more consistency in how LIHAF funding is allocated by local authorities across the country to make essential development financially viable for house builders to deliver private, social and affordable housing. The other key policy measure the Government can take to maintain momentum in housing delivery is the extension of the Help to Buy incentive scheme for first-time buyers of new homes. As you are aware, this scheme is due to expire on the 31st of December 2019. This scheme has had a profound impact on the rate of commencement of new residential scheme units, with a resultant increase in the rate of new housing completions since the introduction of the scheme. Many house builders report that between 40% and 70% of sales of starter homes in their new developments are sold to qualifying first-time buyers who are dependent on the Help to Buy scheme to help assemble the required deposit under the central bank macro-prudential rules. Without this incentive scheme, the rate of commencement of new homes will fall, as hopeful buyers will fail to have the required deposit to secure their residential mortgage. Should government shelve the Help to Buy scheme, it must then be replaced with an alternative scheme mirroring the shared equity loan scheme that has operated in the UK. This has been a success for both first-time buyers and for maintaining levels of new house building. The third key area our submission will cover is people, namely ensuring we have enough skilled workers in the industry. In mid-2016, Solace forecast that the industry would require about 100,000 additional workers over 3 years to replace those retiring or immigrating and to meet the targets set out for housing in Rebuilding Ireland and in the Public Capital Programme, as it was known at the time. Since that point, we have been hiring an additional 1,000 people per month into the industry. That's about 35,000 or so. The shortfall can only be addressed by increasing the numbers of people entering the industry through the CAO and apprenticeship route, increased use of productivity-enhancing technology and building methods, and sourcing people from outside Ireland and through the diaspora. Of course, it is equally important that we retain those that are already in construction, and to that end, we believe that pursuing the highest standards in health, safety and well-being are essential and should be a core requirement for public contracts. At this point, we think we have exhausted the live register as a source of labour. We are targeting the diaspora to get people to return home, and finally, we are increasing our efforts to attract more young people into construction through activities at primary, secondary and third level, including a national awareness campaign and school competition to be rolled out in 2020. This is very much a long-term play for our industry. In our budget submission, we outlined several steps the government could take to increase the numbers entering the industry in the short term and also enhance the level of technology and modern construction practices in the industry. At the outset, due to the importance of the industry to the wider economy, the government should allocate surplus funding from the National Training Fund to support technology adoption such as BIM, lean and off-site construction, and to support SMEs in training and upskilling their staff, in addition to increasing the numbers of apprentices in the industry. On this latter point, DIT recently surveyed industry to identify why the number of apprentices remains low, particularly in areas such as plastering, despite a large increase in activity generally. This highlighted the fact that in some trades, such as plastering, the apprenticeship model is broken and must be recalibrated. In these trades, we are recommending that the government reinstate the student levy for apprentices to allay some of the costs to the small builder who would traditionally have hired the bulk of apprentices in the industry. Finally, I must sound a warning about the divergence in activity between the Greater Dublin area and the regions. The various crane counts show that there are 10 times more cranes visible on the Dublin skyline than in Cork, Limerick and Galway combined. This sort of imbalance is concerning on several fronts and demonstrates the huge challenge the government has in its attempt to deliver on Project Ireland 2040. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council is warning that a slowdown is inevitable, yet there are sectors of the construction industry and regions of the country that still feel the cold air of the recent crisis. Without more connectivity and activity in the regions, we will not have the sorts of dynamic construction companies operating locally to make the NDP and NPF a reality. We can address these challenges, but we must do it together. And we must start now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is a very interesting opening. I have to say, just before I go to, it's interesting listening to the conflicting remarks, between what our previous speakers were in, particularly on the support for the house purchase. Things. I'll tease that out with you more later. But Deputy Boyd Barrett, do you want to start off with a few questions?
Thanks. I have you all to myself. Yeah, I mean, there's some things I
thank you for your contributions, by the way. There's some things I agree with you very strongly, and there's some I don't. I mean, the point about using the surprise corporate tax receipts and putting that into, key strategic areas of infrastructure and to diversify the economy, I agree with you completely, and indeed you might be surprised to know that it would be very much the thrust of people before profits industrial policy is precisely that. But can I suggest that there is a bit of a contradiction between that and your concern about the minimum effective corporate tax rate? Because, I mean, we don't know how long the bonanza will last, right? But one way or another, it's going to come to an end, I think, at some point. And wouldn't we be better off just facing that reality? I mean, I think from a sort of moral point of view, we should address it anyway, because a lot of these tax receipts are coming from a very small number of corporations whose long-term value to our economy is a bit questionable, right? Because we're very vulnerable to what they might do. So wouldn't we be better off actually closing down some of the tax reliefs that they're getting in order to redirect them precisely into the things that you're advocating, into diversifying the economy, into the infrastructure necessary to do that? Do you know what I mean? I mean, to take a very obvious example, and one we mentioned earlier on, research and development tax relief has jumped to 700 million, and that is overwhelmingly going to a small group of IT companies. Now, wouldn't it be better to redirect that money into ramping up our ability to produce the apprentices you're talking about, into developing the infrastructure necessary for more balanced regional development? And you can go through the list. I won't list out all the things we could do with that money, but it seems to me even if we took half of that 700 million and redirected in some of those areas, it would be very good for developing a more sustainable domestic economy, right? Which would act as a better buffer in the long term towards the ups and downs that we might experience. So that's just a question to IBEC. On the CIF stuff, I think it's very interesting. I mean, it's quite stark warning, which I think we should all take very seriously, right? Which is that you're saying, I think, and maybe you could just sort of elaborate this point, that we're not going to meet, currently, we're not going to meet the Rebuilding Ireland targets because of these bottlenecks and problems that you're talking about. And that's very, very worrying indeed. And I mean, I don't know how to frame the question, but I'm not quite sure, and I was talking informally to you before the meeting about this, I'm not sure how we get out of this dilemma, because a lot of the point I made earlier on was a lot of the land that people, developers and so on, and builders bought from NAM at quite low prices. But even at quite low prices, they're having extreme difficulty building and making a profit. Now, if that's true when they, I mean, I know some of them have bought them at the more inflated prices that have developed lately, but even buying them at very low prices, it seems to be very difficult for the construction industry to build and sell at a profit. Maybe explaining the low level of output, and you're saying that that level of output isn't going to increase much more, certainly not to the levels we need, unless something changes. Right? That's very stark. Now, I mean, my solution to that would be, you can't do it, so the state has to intervene. And would it not be better even for you, never mind for the output we need, for the state to say, well, we'll just contract you guys to build what we need to build. So the state has to just accept we need a certain level of output, and it's going to happen come what may, and then we will go out to you guys and say, right, what price to build this stuff? Because it has to be built. We have no choice. rather than what seems to be happening at the moment, that it's dependent on whether you guys can make a profit out of it in order for stuff to be delivered. And the consequence of that is it's not being delivered at the scale we need, and you're saying we may hit a wall fairly soon. So I'm just, posing that as a question. And last thing is about the apprentices. I'm very interested in this, not least because my son just started an apprenticeship as an electrician, which I'm delighted about. But is the problem that it's too expensive for builders to take them on, or is it that there's not enough young people who want to take up apprenticeships? Or is it a bit of both? And what could we do to change it? I mean, one thing that sort of I'm slightly worried about the suggestion that we should increase the levy, reinstate the student levy. Does that mean the students pay it themselves? The students pay the levy themselves? I mean, surely what we should be looking at is making it more attractive for young people to go into the trades, and that would mean maybe the state giving some sort of additional subsidy so that the pay levels essentially for first and second year or whatever apprentices would be better, right? So they might say, yeah, this is an attractive option for me, rather than saying you've got to pay an extra student levy to take the pressure off the builder. And I take the point about the builder, and you're saying that, I still read the percentages earlier, that it's a relatively low percentage of builders who can afford to take on apprentices, right? So they can't do it. But I think loading the cost on the apprentice doesn't seem to me like the best way to deal with that problem. It's more about the state needs to employ more apprentices, or at least support them so that it becomes more attractive for them to be apprentices. So, yeah.
I don't know who wants to start on that. Fergal?
On the corporate tax and R&D, maybe. I do think that the corporate tax trends the last couple of years have been by far the most significant phenomenon in the Irish economy. I said earlier, I think it's probably more significant than the challenges we see in Brexit now. And I suppose, again, to give the potted history of this, Ireland has a long-standing tradition in terms of offering a competitive corporate tax rate. It has been successful in terms of an FDI-driven economic model. There was a fundamental shift in the nature of that model, and Pat mentioned earlier the cranes that we observe in Dublin, right? And this is all connected, because in 2015, when the OECD did this BEPS 1 reform, it fundamentally changed how companies structure themselves and where activity sits in the global economy. And what essentially BEPS 1 meant was that corporates had to fully align substance and profits. Ireland has had a long history of substance, right? We've always had the substance. We always had the Intels and their predecessors, doing that significant manufacturing, research and development, and the business model evolving and reinventing what they were doing here. We've had companies who've been here for 50 years, but they're doing something completely different now than they were 50 years ago. So we've always had that model, and it's been real substance. There's real substance in the Irish FDI sector. Other countries didn't have substance. There was lots of other islands out there that offered just a tax rate and not a whole lot else happening. We've always had the substance in the Irish economy. And in 2015, when we did that BEPS 1 reform, we saw a significant increase in the nature of the roles and the decision makers coming in to Irish businesses, because they were the new rules of international tax, that the decision makers had to be sitting here. We're now seeing a lot more European headquarters, EMEA headquarters. Predominantly, they're actually the people behind those cranes. It is, it isn't Irish debt, it isn't Irish banks funding housing by and large, you observe those cranes. It is actually this hyper-globalisation of the Irish economy and very significant investment and a long-term commitment to the economy, Deputy, I think, from largely Irish international global corporations. And what they're doing here is cutting-edge, world-leading. There's a lot of countries out there, they are not happy with the success of the Irish economy, right? Predominantly European countries. It seems to us now that some of the major international blocs are coalescing around a new reform of this global tax. They don't like the answer they got the last time in BEPS 1. They're going back again, and what their core objective is going to be is to shift some of that tax revenue, not to where the value is created, not to where the substance is happening in Irish operations, in pharmaceuticals, in medical devices, in technology, but actually to where they have the consumers. This is a global war for tax revenue, and the countries that are big have the might, they have the consumers, and they want more of that revenue, because they're arguing, and they're doing this quite effectively through the OECD, that the value in a lot of these corporations is created where the consumer interfaces with the product that's being developed. This isn't just digital, it's not just technology, it's happening in relation to the value of brands, in relation to other intangibles. And they want to redesign the global corporate tax system, and they want to put that revenue in the countries where the consumers are, not in the countries actually where the innovation is happening and where the value is being created. So I think we do have a lot of merit in terms of what we're arguing for, but I actually agree with you. I think there is a global momentum here that we're not going to have the same competitive advantage on tax in the future. I absolutely agree with you. And I think we've got to prepare for that transition. But in order to prepare for that transition, we've got to be using the opportunity we have now, the proceeds that are at our disposal, to invest in the innovation and the education. I sat in some of the last session and I heard some of the numbers that were discussed around our innovation spend. It's pitiful low. We don't have a world-class infrastructure, and colleagues from CIF are going to talk about that in terms of the blockages and how that's impacting on the wider business community. And we don't have a world-class education system. So the 14.3 billion that we got in a surprise in just 4 years, 11.5 of that went in supplementary estimates, and it almost all went to day-to-day spending. So you could look at the last 4 years and you could say we've blown a golden opportunity. But this isn't done yet. We could still have some upside. And I'm saying we've got to reset the whole budgetary process now. And we've got to be absolutely clear that the upside that we get from here on out is put into those strategic investments. And that's what protects the model for the future. Because if we lose our corporation tax advantage today, we haven't put the building blocks in place to be competitive on things like the skills and the innovation and the infrastructure. We're not at world standard on those. So we're not going to prosper. So we need to use this transition opportunity but invest in the future. And I might ask Jared to come in on the R&D tax credit, because I think that's an example, and I think the latest figures are probably about 500 million, which is worrying for us, because companies are doing less R&D, which is a concern, right, from where it was a couple of years ago. But I think that is well proven that that is a scheme that has brought additional and mobile research activity into Ireland with a significant return to the state that wouldn't have happened otherwise. But I might ask Ger, because Ger's conducted a fairly extensive study on this particular scheme, and give maybe some of the findings and the economics on it.
Yeah, so there was a recent consultation with the Department of Finance and the R&D tax credit. So what the figures show is that that spend, that 700 million it went up to in 14-15, has come back down over recent years. We're back down to about 500 million a year, and that's been falling the last 2 or 3 years, which is worrying because it means less R&D is being done, or at least less qualifying R&D. I know we've looked at the studies about R&D tax credits and how effective they are worldwide, and there is in some countries a question about whether it's more effective to give a tax credit or a grant, right? Because there is some studies that show subsidies are better and some studies that show tax is better. The studies in Ireland show that tax is by a margin of a long margin, much better. So for every euro that we give in a subsidy, we get about €2.5 in R&D in private companies. The reason for that is, I guess, is that over the past, you've a kind of a double benefit of the R&D tax credit. One side is that it's attractive from an inward FDI point of view because you get the tax credit itself. And the other part is that it takes the cost out of R&D. So we've seen big challenges in that. The big challenge actually for the R&D on the R&D side is direct funding. Totally agree with you on that. Direct funding should be much higher than it is, and as Fergal said, it's pretty pitiful as it is. The other part as well is that a lot of SMEs don't use the R&D tax credit because it is too difficult for them to use administratively. The UK, Norway, France, other countries all have separate R&D tax credits for small companies that give them cash, they're refundable, they're paid quicker, they're administratively a lot less burdensome, and you see a lot better results out of the R&D tax credit. So if you want to get more money or more value for money out of the money we're already spending, you try and make it easier for SMEs to use it rather than shift to complete these subsidies. And we actually think along with the early tax credit, you need to be putting money into innovation anyway, and using this corporate tax as the opportunity. One comment on apprenticeships. So we'll have an ask that there's some offsetting, so it's not just in construction, but across pretty much every company that we talk to, that take-up of apprenticeships has been low across the board. A lot of that is that you're giving away a member of staff for 2 days a week and still paying them. That we're saying that there probably has to be some kind of subsidy to get companies to take that up. And at the state, maybe it's a tax offset against corporation tax, for example, or maybe it's a direct subsidy. We don't really care which model you go down, but that you take some of the cost off, particularly smaller companies who can't afford to pay someone for 7 days or 6 days, and only get them for 3 or 4. The final on social housing, yeah, certainly. Look, I think there's real challenges there. The cost of land is a big issue. The cost of construction is really pro-cyclical in Ireland. It's only going to go one direction while the economy's getting stronger. We've seen some signs, and indeed we've talked to a lot of developers that they, and I think we agree with the CIF on this, that the pace of delivery of new housing will continue to go up, but it's going to slow in terms of the growth. 2 reasons for that. One is that I think affordability has reached its limits, particularly in urban areas, that a lot of households, about 90% or 95% actually of households last year were more than 3.25 in loan-to-income ratios in Dublin, which means that there's just not a lot of space. If incomes are growing by 5%, you can't have house prices growing by 10 or 15%. That can't continue. And then, so that sets the top on the market in terms of what people can afford. And then land prices, you're competing with industrial or commercial or public buildings in some cases. So that's putting land prices are going up. The cost of construction is going up because more people are getting hired. There's more competition, and we're low in terms of the unemployment rate. So that's going to squeeze margins. It's going to make it more difficult over future years to deliver housing, which means we think you probably would see maybe 21,000 houses delivered this year. It's not anywhere near the rate of growth we need to be at to get to the levels we're going to need to get to. Social housing delivery, look, we've been in this committee several times and said it over the years, you need a much bigger scale of social housing delivery, direct delivery. At the end of the day, though, the construction sector is going to have to, you're kind of cutting out the developer in the middle, but the construction sector, the builders, and in terms of the workforce that you need for apprenticeships and some of the trades, you're still going to need those people to deliver it no matter what happens. So that's still an issue. Even if the state decides to deliver, you've still got the who do we get to deliver it, and that's going to be the big challenge. We've heard from members in other sectors that workers going to construction, but not maybe at the rates that you would expect in previous years, particularly in the mid-2000s, where a lot of people went from manufacturing into construction. It's not happening at the same rate, but it is happening. That trend is probably the main place left. I'd agree. I don't think there's many workers left in the live register with trades, less than a couple of thousand. So you're going to have to find them from other sectors, which builds up costs for lots of other businesses, and probably is going to be a challenge for other sectors too. So it's difficult, I agree, to see how this gets fixed quickly, and that's a major challenge for employers as well.
Okay, Pat, do you want to come in on any aspect of that there?
I may work backwards from Deputy's questions, and I'll pass the housing on to you. I'm going to start with the apprenticeships because this is a great topic. I'm delighted to hear your son has gone into being an electrician. It's a fabulous way of life, something you can travel with. It's a skill you get, you never lose. To address the issue of the funding, what we're suggesting is that to reinstate a levy that was taken away was removed in the budget of 2014. So in phases 4 and 6 of the apprenticeship, when they're in the Institutes of Technology, Solus used to pay from the NTF budget parts of the money for the training. That was taken away in the budget 2014. We're saying it should be reinstated to help them. In relation to what can we do about it, there's a lot going on at the moment. One of the biggest problems we've got is that when you ask about builders need confidence. They need confidence that there's going to be work in front of them to take on an apprentice for a 4-year programme. And unfortunately, that confidence is just not there at the moment. The work that we are seeing in this country is largely driven from multinational companies that are putting private money in to having construction taking place, principally in the Dublin region. But we need more than that. There's not enough certainty in that for builders to invest in apprenticeships. Everybody has been through the most awful recession, and people are scared to invest now. They don't want to be as big as they were. They don't want to earn as much money as they did back in the good times. They just want to have a decent living. So there's a confidence issue which really does need a release of work, and a sustained release of work to try and grow again. What can we do with the apprentices? We've got to attract them in. And I'll mention to you about Ireland Skills Live that took place in March in the RDS. And I don't know if anyone here attended it, but we were part of the sponsors for it. And what it was 25 different apprenticeships that took part in a competition to find out who was the best apprentice in each 25 of them in the RDS. In the public eye, against the clock, against each other, competing in joinery, hairdressing, heavy machinery maintenance, aircraft maintenance, welding. It was absolutely fantastic. And the schools came into it in busloads. 11,000 students came in from all over the country on the Thursday and the Friday. And there was nothing like the excitement in the faces of the younger generation looking at the opportunities that were in front of them. There was something there for everybody. You had an individual working on a helicopter in front of you, a small helicopter, and over here was another individual working on a jet engine. You had guys doing welding behind red boards that we could see through, and you could see what they were working on. We had guys in bricklaying competitions. We had guys doing painting, hand painting. Everything was there. And that, on the Saturday, we were a bit concerned that the footfall might go down with the schools closed. But on the Saturday morning, it was carloads of families coming in. Mothers and fathers with their children coming in to see what was all this about. And a question that was asked a lot was, where do we find out about all this? And there is no one place to find out about all this. But it was an absolutely brilliant success. And it was a success that came from collaboration between the industry and the state bodies that actually have been organising this for years. But for years, you would have a joinery competition taking place in a joinery in DIT with nobody looking at them. But what happened a couple of years ago was that people went to the World Championship in Azerbaijan and they saw our winners taking part in a competition in the public eye, so they felt they were disadvantaged. So the industry got together with the Higher Education Authority, got together with Solace, and everybody was a little afraid, is this going to work or is it not going to work? The industry sponsored it, the agencies got behind it, and it was a tremendous success. And I would recommend, when it's taking place next year, that all of you go to it, because if nothing else, you will get a lift from it. So we've a job to do with the younger generation to say, you don't have to go to a third level college to get a piece of paper in whatever it is. Whatever you're good at is what we want you to do. And there's a success model out there at the moment that is based on league tables for schools that seems to rate success as the number of students they get to go into university. We would like to see a different model of success where the schools put their students into what they are good at and what they want to do. And if my local school produces the local electricians, the local engineers, the local painters, the local hairdressers, that to me is success. So as part of that, we are putting together a campaign to attract people into the construction industry, into everything that's in the industry. We do not favour people going into one thing over the other. People should go into what they are good at. And the professional bodies, that we speak to them all the time, Engineers Ireland, the surveyors, the architects, they all support what we want to do. And as I say, we won't discriminate. What people are good at is what they should go into. So,
I'm going to ask you just to conclude on that, if you can, because I have a few more deputies coming in.
Okay,
So,
it's a topic I feel passionate about.
I can gather that, but I want to, we have a deadline we're creeping towards in terms of access here.
Well, do you mind if I pass the housing question to Parliament?
Very quickly, Tom, if you want to.
Yeah, well, just briefly, and certainly it is a dilemma in terms of the cost of producing the house, the incentive for the builder to take the risk and get a profit, and then the other end, the ability of someone to buy. And I'm told by 2 different house builders that are very active in the market today that you can go into any site in Dublin today and you get a house to buy. The actual supply has caught up with the ability to buy. And, you know, that's a bit of a dilemma. Whether it be the central bank discretion that they have is running out or whatever, but I mean, that's where we're at. We've been lobbying very hard, and I know Good Buddies were out over the weekend with a report favouring the continuation of the Help to Buy scheme. We certainly find that it's a major, major factor in terms of the first-time buyer being able to buy. And one of the builders told me yesterday about, first of all, he said he had a list of 400 potential buyers. He had to go through every one of them to sell 12 houses. He said he had one guy that was so enthused about getting the house, but he was 10k short between his deposit and his mortgage and the few quid he had. And unfortunately, if you don't have your 10k, you know, that's it. So there might be some notion out there that if we can press down the price of houses, that, you know, it'll become more affordable. But unfortunately, the margin is so tight and the viability of building is so tight at the moment with the costs that are there, it's only going to slow down. I know of 2 big sites, 2 big players that have actually stalled, not stalled, but slowed down their production because the buyers are not coming along. So that's a real dilemma that we're going to have to deal with in the next budget. The costs are increasing, and I think sometimes the inflation, the discussion about inflation in construction is exaggerated. Certainly there is some inflation there on the labour side, and obviously lots of commentary about some of the big projects, the National Children's Hospital, inflation being blamed as being why the price has escalated. Not quite the case. Underestimation was a big factor. So, you know, I think there's a lot of areas to be dealt with there, and we certainly would see priority to continuation of the Help to Buy scheme and the LIHAF scheme, where infrastructure being introduced by the local authority, whether it be water or roads or access or whatever. A very, very positive announcement on that. Very, very substantial funding. I think a fraction of it has been drawn down. It's extremely complicated, it's extremely slow, and so on, and it is certainly holding up some of the development as well.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Deputy Lahart.
I was absent, but I was here for the previous session, and I've read your contributions, your submissions. So a couple of things, I mean, that I was saying in the last session is on the Budgetary Oversight Committee, I certainly look out for themes at this time of the year and common themes that are coming up. Neri will have put forward a view that's completely contrary to the views that you guys have put forward in relation to the subsidised housing, the Help to Buy scheme. So they just did that 20 minutes ago, and it's interesting to hear the arguments. Tom, what you said, you know, could make a headline that supply has caught up with ability to pay, and that paints a particular picture. Supply of housing has caught up with ability to pay, but the key word in that for me is with ability to pay. And, you know, so the people that we don't count in the homeless figures or those who are waiting to buy houses are, whatever it is, 250,000 adults who remain at home. During the recent election cycle, politicians get an opportunity to knock on doors. And in my own constituency, there was a house in Kingswood, in Tala, middle-class area, where the mother reported that all 4 of her adult children had returned home to live, all working, 1 to save for the deposit, another because they couldn't afford the rent, and the other 2 for similar kind of reasons, maybe a little bit more complex. And what came home to me too, and I mean, you guys in the building industry, particularly Tom, you need to, you know, these cuckoo funds and this big push to buy to rent, you know, build to rent. You need to help government and help politicians in addressing this. So there was a couple I met up in Elder Heath, a new development, fine development in Kiltipper and Tala. They had 90,000 of a deposit. They were paying €1,800 in rent. But when they got their deposit and bought their house, their mortgage is €975 a month. So it's a saving of almost 1,000 that was going into a black hole. Now you have a responsibility here, as much as policymakers, in relation to this. The apprenticeships, Pat, I mean, I ran in a by-election in 2014, and I remember looking round at the time. We were still maybe emerging from the crash, and I remember reading a SIP2 paper on apprenticeships, and they were very much way ahead of their time in terms of their thinking around apprenticeships. It had been produced in 2013, and we are now in 2019. 4% of our apprentices are women. I think 39% of them are women in Northern Ireland. I think it's almost equal in Scotland. The areas that you were talking about, like hairdressing, front desk stuff, and tourism-related business right across to sheet metal working, this was flagged 6 years ago. But I am interested that apprenticeships and investment in apprenticeships is a theme that's emerging among a number of the contributors who've come before us. In Denmark, 11% of their workforce are apprentices. 45% of those on their apprenticeship programmes are women, and apprenticeship programmes are open to people from the age of 18 to 60. You know, that there's constant retraining and the constant ability to do that. So, look, this again nudges a conversation forward. I'm always particularly struck, and will be as passionate as you, when the Leaving Cert results come out in August. And it's all talk about CAO that day. And Sean O'Rourke's programme is full of it, and Pat Kenny's programme is full of it. And you get 30 seconds on apprenticeships. In the UK, you know, they set up an apprenticeship forum headed by some captain of industry, where their objective is that every parent of a child in the UK would consider an apprenticeship for their child. Now, I think we've become overeducated in Ireland. There's a lot of those channels that we assumed traditionally would cater for the kid with skills and with physical skills started offering business degrees and marketing degrees. You know, the institutes of technology. Bullshit courses in terms of what they qualified people for and the proof of the pudding was in the eating. When these students emigrated, they found that they really were qualified for nothing. And as you said, the ones that went away as electricians or plumbers or carpenters got a job the day they landed in another country, but we want to keep them here. So I would encourage you, keep banging this drum. But it requires change from parents, from education, and a change in how apprenticeships are viewed. Not as something, when I was in school, a lot of lads left post-intercert and went straight into apprenticeships and were studying with it. It doesn't happen anymore, and we lauded the fact that people don't leave school post-intercert. But it's a channel that really needs to be open, because we're not bearing the fruits now because we don't have the workforce. So I'm 100% behind you on that. The unexpected windfalls, there's really interesting themes today, you know. So we had IFAC and we had ESRI, and so you guys are on the same kind of sheet as ICTU and as NARI. IFAC are saying this has to be squirreled away into a prudence account. NARI and ICTU are kind of saying, you know, once off, unrepeatable capital projects, and you're saying the same, that it should be earmarked for capital projects and to ensure the delivery of the NDP. So they're the themes who say how we spend windfall, because this has been a common theme for 3 years at the Budgetary Oversight Committee in advance of budgets. You're not saying anything about demographics, by the way. That was a theme that was coming up as well in terms of ageing population and how that may influence or affect your workforce. And apprenticeships, really keen on that, and certainly I'd be pushing for something on that in the contribution that this committee makes to the Minister. So thank you for those. Just if there's any response you have on any of the comments made, you're welcome.
Thank you. Very, very technical term in the middle of that there to describe certain degrees, Deputy. I don't know who wants to open up with a reply. Fergal to Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Deputy. Two specific issues I'm going to come back to you on. One again is on the windfall of the corporate tax. We had some discussion with Deputy Barrett, and the other is on that kind of broader view of apprenticeships. We're very clear on the corporate tax surprise, and again, I'll repeat these figures. Right, this is 14.3 billion in 4 years. Right, 11.5 billion of that has gone into supplementary estimates each year over the last 4 years. That's the cumulative that we've added this up to, right? So these are decisions we've taken collectively in the last 4 years. We don't think they've been good decisions. We think they're putting real risks to fiscal stability. We now think that the excessive corporate tax reliance to fund day-to-day spending gives us a greater risk of a significant fiscal crisis than our reliance on stamp duty did over a decade ago. So that's the risk we see in the economy. We've got to make this transition away to a new enterprise-based model, much more greater support for the indigenous sector, for SMEs, for entrepreneurship. But we've got to invest in the building blocks. We're not hitting our marks on innovation. We're not delivering the public capital infrastructure at the pace that we need to be delivering it. And we're not supporting our education system. So you spoke a lot about apprenticeships. We are completely neglecting.
You raised this last year as well with the third level sector, I recall that.
We continue to completely neglect our third level sector. And we're now seeing that in terms of outcomes, we're seeing it in terms of student choices, and worryingly, we're seeing it in terms of perception. Because if we are asking all of these companies that are spending all this money in our physical infrastructure and building the wonderful facilities in Dublin at the moment, that we're asking them to have their global intellectual property sitting in Ireland, and we're not minding our own intellectual property in terms of our funding of the universities, they're quickly going to see that we're not a serious player here in terms of operating at a global level. Because we are not making the smart decisions around investment. We have been frittering this away in day-to-day spending, a lot of it into health. You know, when you think of the public scrutiny that has happened around the budget for the construction of National Children's Hospital, and yet we do not get the same type of scrutiny on the day-to-day spending on the 11.5 billion that we have overspent on supplementary estimates in the space of 4 years. And we're getting very little scrutiny on that from what we can see. On the apprenticeships, and I know that the CIF colleagues will probably may want to come back again on construction-specific issues. From a broad business perspective, and I said at the outset, IBEC has over 40 different sectors, trade associations within IBEC. A number of those have been instrumental in terms of getting new apprenticeships up and running in things like financial services, things like manufacturing. We're looking at options around retail, for example. So we're really trying to broaden out that conversation in terms of apprenticeship options. Uptake is slow. We're disappointed. Some of the ones that we have sponsored through our trade associations, we are disappointed in terms of the uptake that's coming in. As Ger said in the previous response, we do think there is a cost issue here that has to be looked at in terms of cost to small employers in particular. But collectively, we need to do an awful lot more to brand, promote, and to really encourage young people to look at the options. And a lot of this is connected back to education sector reform as well. So it's not just about making these decisions at the age of 16 and 17. This has got to go right through our education system in terms of our approach to learning, junior cert reform, how we're educating through the national school curricula. Because again, we see a lot of our companies who engage on things like the gender challenge we have in certain sectors in terms of very low female participation. They're going on to primary schools. They know that by the time you get to secondary schools, far too late. So that's where this work has got to start. But it's a much more systematic and fundamental reform of our education system. And part of that is this broad perspective on the opportunities in apprenticeships. Compared to where we were 5 years ago, we've achieved an awful lot. When I look at the new options we have now for apprenticeships, we've achieved an awful lot. But uptake has been disappointing and slow, and we do want to see some changes in that.
Can I just ask supplementary on that? Because it's a cultural. It is a culture. We've lost the culture of it, of apprentices. I'm 54, it was very much alive when I was doing my Leaving Cert and Intercert. I think probably maybe up to a third of my classmates left after Intercert for apprenticeships. They're not as sexy in terms of options for kids. And that's the first thing I think that has to be addressed. I don't know if you have any ideas around that. As I said, you listen to Sean O'Rourke, third week in August, 99, I'm not exaggerating it, 99% of the programme post-Leaving Cert will be focused on third level, university and college, and there'll be a minute devoted to apprenticeships. So how do we change that culture?
But I've got to be careful because I could go on a bit.
I won't let you a second time.
We have in what we have been doing, carried out a behaviour and attitude survey of a very widespread group. We hired Tineo to go off and do this for us. So we wanted to find out, why is construction not attractive? So we've got a lot of information back, and yes, We're not selling ourselves as good as the Googles and the Amazons and so on in this world. But they have pointed us in the direction of the tools to use to change that. And I'll stop there because I go on too long. So we are working at that. I'm totally with you on the perceptions. Perception is a huge thing here. There are historical reasons for that, which again I could go on a bit about, but I won't. The one massive bit of hope that I got from the RDS at that Skills Ireland was that if we give the information to the mothers of Ireland will make the right decision. I have no doubt about it. At the moment, all that they are receiving is just this wealth of information about going to university. But if they are given the choices, the options, the understanding of what is there, they'll know their children better than anyone, and they will point them in the direction of what works for them. So I think I'm hopeful. There's an awful lot of us that agree about it. Diversity was mentioned here, and it's one of the things that we've got to battle with in construction. It's not diverse enough. But again, it's part of our campaign. And again, as you said, it's back to the primary schools. We have to start there.
What could be done in the budget?
Well, in the budget, as we say, restoring that levy would help. We're looking at doing the skills campaign, so we are at the moment canvassing for funds for that, and we're doing this from the private sector as well. So we would be looking for an injection of help from the government agencies on that. But we are absolutely dead serious about this. This is something that we have to do. We do not have a choice. We need the people coming into construction to do the work that this country needs. So we're going to make it happen, but it'll happen better if we do it in collaboration with the state agencies. In relation to Sean O'Rourke will be missing a trick if he doesn't turn up at Skills Ireland next year and broadcast some morning from it. And then he'll see something different and he'll get it out in the airwaves, that there's something different going on. Just two other quick comments. In relation to housing, I know Deputy Boyd Barrett asked a question about the state building houses, and I suppose what we would say on that is we need a lot of different initiatives to overcome the problem that we've got. A lot of the initiatives that have been pushed out have been working, and we've got the output up. But like any problem that you must have enough tools in your chest to go at the problem the right way. One of the tools that's missing at the moment is the state is not doing enough. So yes, I do think we shouldn't rely on any one thing. It's got to be a combination of public and private. The private will always have that entrepreneurial stuff. They'll take a risk and a chance on things that the state won't do. But when it comes to solving problems, it has to be all of us together trying to do it. And again, in relation to capital projects and the unexpected tax funds, the one thing that I would say on that is it just doesn't seem to be realised by people that if they make a decision today to say, we're going to go ahead with that, 4 years later, you will see a shovel going in the ground. So it is no good for us to wait until next October and find out whether it's a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit or what it is. We actually have to be decisive and go ahead and press the button on projects now, because there is nothing in construction that happens tomorrow. Press the button today, 4 years before there'll be a shovel in the ground, and that's with everything going right.
Okay. I'm going to go to Deputy Broughan now because I'm conscious of our overall time, and I'm also conscious of I have some points I want to make myself as well. So, Deputy Broughan.
Just to say, I mean, you're talking about entrepreneurial spirit, enterprise. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Italian economist. Well, she teaches in London, Mariano Mazzucato, and she wrote a famous book called The Entrepreneurial State, and she shows how in the IT industry and electronics generally, almost all major entrepreneurial decisions in relation to developing all the elements of the web was done by the state sector and the university sector, not by private industry. In fact, there's private entrepreneurs here, Facebooks and so on, Google, they ran with the actual systems that had been put in place by the state. So I don't see where this kind of is coming from. Clearly, what happened in relation to housing is, and I worked briefly in the construction industry when I was a kid, What happened was the Ahern government, the McCreevy government, decimated the construction ability of city and county councils, ran down the workforces, got rid of apprentices, got rid of skilled tradesmen. That's what happened, and we didn't have the kind of state involvement in housing which we had, along with the private. And I worked on both public and private estates, for contractors. Just asking me, why are you moaning about Dublin? About the amount of cranes in Dublin? I mean, shouldn't you be rejoicing in that? If you take most powerful economies, you tend to find a major capital city. 40 million Japanese live in the greater Tokyo area. 20 million Argentinians live in Buenos Aires. Out of 48 million, by the way, 40 million out of 125 in Japan. You tend to find that in Vienna, and other historical reasons for it, half the population practically in Vienna state. So, I mean, what's the big deal about this? Shouldn't we be rejoicing in the fact that when you go up to the top of this building, of our buildings, and you look across at southeast, that there's about 10 high-rise buildings rising up over the fabric of the city, and all those cranes are there. Indeed, out in my own constituency of DBN, shouldn't you be rejoicing in that? We've got some changes now with Limerick, obviously. Limerick City and County, as I understand it, will have one leader. We have the new city of Cork County, or the new enlarged Cork City, which obviously 200,000 people and upwards. Obviously, in the neighbouring jurisdiction, we've Belfast and Derry and so on, Galway coming. So I mean, why moan about this? Why not just say that what we need to do is to expand on that and to have, to build the houses, and particularly in the Dublin region, because a lot of the high-rise stuff obviously is for commercial, the 24-storey down the Liffey and so on and so forth, and other neighbouring buildings. That so shouldn't we be just rejoicing in that? In relation to this. And you talk about confidence. I mean, like normal times. When were there normal times? All times have problems, have issues, I mean, confidence. You've got the National Development Plan, you've the broadband plan, you've retrofitting. You guys were telling us, I think, and you men and women were telling us that we're going to have 50,000 houses coming on stream in 2023-24, etc., etc. None of us, by the way, believe on this side of the room that supply and demand are in equilibrium. That's fantasy. It is not the case. There's no question that's not the case, because in my constituency, we've 8,000 families on a housing list. We've 20,000 in Dublin City alone. We've 100,000, nearly 130,000, we believe the true figures are, in the whole country. So that there's no equilibrium. We're miles from equilibrium because, nothing was done over 7 or 8 years. But, what more confidence do you need, even with Brexit or whatever? If there is a moderately soft landing, which there probably will be under their new Prime Minister or whatever, we're going to have a lot of construction, So, I mean, shouldn't we, be planning forward on that front rather than, confidence, etc., etc. What is confidence? I mean, confidence was there in the late 90s, early 90s, and so on and so forth. It's the fact that the state abrogated its role after 28, 29 to actually do something about it. I go along with you actually on the shared equity. I think that would be a useful development as well. Just in relation to apprenticeships, I mean, obviously Solas, I think, we've given Solas the responsibility, etc. But even before the crash, as a deputy, I used to find that it was very hard to get sponsors. When the new system came in, it was the 7 segments, when you had the 5 on the site or whatever, or the 5 in college and the 2 on the site, you still could find kids, young boys and girls, coming along and getting 4 or 5 sections and then struggling to get an employer who would take them over the line. I think, what the Brits have done, as far as I understand it, is they've elevated apprenticeships to degree kind of level. Because let's face it, I notice in construction now how things have changed since the days when I was assisting plasterers and so on. And the way, for example, there's a big site in our constituency, well, there's many big sites in our constituency, but the role that the crane drivers are playing, and the fact that walls, practically whole apartments are arriving in blocks. The technology is changing. I mean, it's high tech. So why shouldn't, in fact, my colleague's son or whatever, shouldn't it be degree level, level 8 or whatever it is, your basic degree level? So there's no big deal. And if you go to an IT, last week, we gave the power to the ITs to award any degree they liked. or whatever, up to doctoral level. So I mean, why not? If you're a great brickie, surely you have that, your degree level really in terms of construction, etc., etc. So isn't that the way to go, to equalise the thing and say all of these professions, whether you're an economist or a brickie, we need you both, or whatever important job that you're doing. So I don't see why there should be that type of problem. Just to go back then to IBEC. Like talking about, and I think I'm a director of a company, so I'm kind of one of your members of IBEC. But to go back to what you're saying, I mean, we've one of the lowest. Neary was here earlier on, the institute. They were showing us in a table how we have, I think, in the top 10 wealthier countries, we're ninth lowest in terms of spending, of public sector spending. We're one of the lowest. And clearly in terms of, why do we have supplementary budgets? Because the health budget is not sufficient to run a national health service, which is what we want. I mean, and if we're going to have that kind of, like for example, Denmark #1, Sweden #2, Finland 3, Austria 4, Belgium 5, France 6, Netherlands 7, Germany 8. We're coming in behind them. But I mean, if we're to be at their levels of public infrastructure, transport, whatever, for the new, the carbon plan and so on and so forth, surely we want to have to spend money. And by the way, surely that's going to build confidence for builders as well. I mean, we're going to have to do loads and loads of buildings. So I don't see why people are worried about confidence. Sorry, Caherlock, that's.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Jeanette. I saw you first there indicating.
Yeah, just to respond to a couple of your points, Deputy. First of all, thank you for mentioning Mariana Mazzucato, because she's actually quoted in our forthcoming report on an examination productivity in construction. And you're correct, she's very strong on the role of innovation in terms of transformative economic policy, in terms particularly innovation and investment into human capital, R&D and so on. And there's a significant element of our budget submission which will be formalised in the next few weeks, which is focusing on the role of R&D and innovation in construction. And I suppose linking education and training across the various sides of the industry and the sector. Because education, as we know, it's the primary activity of universities and the IoTs who feed in through the skills development for the sector. But the production of goods and services is the primary activity of companies in construction. So what we would be ultimately aiming for down the road is a designated centre for construction research, development and innovation, which would be a bridge between academia, the research community and the construction sector. And we've committed to progressing and pursuing that agenda, and we've already established a joint industry and academic steering committee to pursue and work through the construction sector group in that line. But through our submission, we are calling for greater investment in construction-related R&D and innovation, particularly around things such as consideration of the existing R&D tax credit, how that meets the needs of construction SMEs. One of the reasons for that is often the types of activities and services that construction companies are undertaking. It's sometimes difficult for that to be captured in the very clear black and white that revenue would perhaps review the construction R&D type credit situation. So that's just one of the points I wanted to make around the importance of innovation and the linking and the linkages that we need to continue to build between the education and training sectors and industry, so that, as Pat was detailing, the particular details of our pilot scheme, which we'll be launching in the autumn, can garner additional supports from all stakeholders. And a focus, I think, of that scheme, and a focus indeed of a lot of the policies that we're adopting through CIF at the moment, is around embracing a whole of life career in construction, so that it's not just about the qualification that gets you the initial job, but it's providing the tools that employers provide, the supports as well to lifelong learning and career progression, so that we offer rewarding and sustainable careers to those who are now entering and choosing to enter into construction, which will obviously improve the diversity of the overall construction sector itself, and we hope give rewarding careers to those that choose to enter.
Thank you.
Chairman, I'll just respond briefly. Deputy Lahart, first of all, I think you were suggesting that we were somehow or other favouring the institutional investors and the build-to-rent model. I don't think that's the case, and I think the President referred to that. I think it's part of a very important model. But it is certainly one thing, it gives certainty of funding at the moment that isn't coming from anywhere else. I think a figure that we've come up with lately, just 6% of our social housing has been built by the state. Otherwise, they're buying it from the private sector. So I think that's this co-living that got lots of negative publicity. I think that certainly has a place as well for a sector of the workforce here that are young people that want to just spend the minimum amount of time in a living accommodation and live and work in the city. So I think we need solutions in all of those areas. To Deputy Broughan, I didn't hear anyone moaning. If we gave that impression, it certainly wasn't the case. Because I think we're delighted that we have 123 or 25 cranes in Dublin, but I think the point that the President made was there's less than a dozen elsewhere, and it is this massive discrepancy. The bulk of our members in actual numbers are all over the country, and unfortunately they're all commuting and helping to clog up the streets and cause all the congestion that is there and all the extra cost that's involved. So if we had that extra infrastructure and, that they could work in a general vicinity.
Well, we need a world-class capital city, don't we?
Of course, and we're not saying that, but 10%, there's a difference between, like, if you have 50-50 between the economic activity and the capital, and otherwise, that might be acceptable. But if it is 90-10, that's where we have the problem. We believe there's a bit of scope there. And you mentioned the high-rise buildings, still having a major struggle getting the high-rise buildings and getting our heights. Some fantastic
Well, there seems to be a new
designs
city
and so
council
on.
policy on it now.
Yeah, well, the government have a policy as well, and they seem to be at loggerheads, and that the minister's recommendations are still not being taken on board. We certainly do need to increase the height as well. And I think just lest the notion go out that our apprenticeships in construction are at a low ebb. The very apprenticeship that Deputy Barrett referred to his son, electricians and plumbers are flying high. There are thousands upon thousands of people in each of them, mainly because we have big contractor firms in that mechanical electrical side that are working for the Googles, that are working for the Facebooks, that are building data centres, not just in Dublin here and around the country, but all over Europe at the moment. So that's a very good model. It's the wet trades is probably the one that is necessary currently for house building, and unfortunately the structure of the industry and so on doesn't encourage employers to an extent as well. We have a weakness on the employer side, but we have a mega weakness in terms of creating just the awareness amongst people that might choose to do that.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to Deputy Chambers now.
Yeah, apologies, I had to pop out. We're speaking in the chamber as well, so we're kind of trying to make 2 and 3 of ourselves some of these days. So I'll be very brief because I know you want to wrap up, Chair, and to our guests as well. Just 2 separate questions. First, to the construction issues. I know you've touched upon workforce being a key one, and that you've now exhausted the live register and you're looking beyond. I suppose from a budgetary oversight perspective, and we're heading into the next budget, we're heading for summer recess shortly, and when we come back we'll be full into discussing Budget 2020. So in terms of Budget 2020, what would your key asks be of us to consider? So in terms of addressing the workforce issue, but also the cost of building, what would your key asks be?
In relation to the workforce, yes, we have exhausted the live register fairly well, but we're still working on it, and we are actually still, through different training courses, having success with getting people off of long-term unemployment into construction. Going forward, we are going to have to bring in more into the industry from school leavers, but we also have to look at the technology. And off-site construction has become very prevalent across the world, and we are getting into it more slowly here, I think. We have people that are willing to do it, but it does come back to that awful word, confidence. If people want to set up a fabrication plant in Ireland, there's a big investment in that, and they want to know that they're going to have the output there, that they're going to be able to sell it. So it's a huge part of what we need, really, is to push the pipeline of work, because at the moment a huge amount of that pipeline of work is coming from the private sector. And I read the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council document last weekend, and the funny thing is, when I got to the end of it, I wasn't feeling all that great, and I was wondering, why was I not feeling good after reading this advisor's document? And I went back and looked at it again, and And then I started looking at the words they were using, and the word overheating was in it 39 times, shock 78 times, debt 173 times, adverse 23 times. You know. It was a report that just made you worried that everybody is saying something is going wrong. And there's parts of our industry, and okay, there's the civil engineering sector and there's the regions that haven't really had the same crack of the whip as other areas. And we do know that connectivity is a huge part of the social fabric of our regions. And there are parts of the country that are not connected properly to other parts of it. Dublin itself needs to go underground, has to go underground. There's no more room in the streets. So if we want to have a fabulous capital city, we have to move forward with the projects. And there's the Metrolink project is there, and you know it's been going slowly for the last number of months. And we need these things to move forward quickly because we don't see big projects starting on the ground until 2020. That'll be the first of them if they start. And that is not giving the confidence to people to go ahead and invest and use their skills to make a product that people will buy. So pushing out the pipeline of work is probably one of the biggest things that we need, and to support our campaign for bringing people into the construction industry.
Very good. Just then, I suppose, to talk to Oireachtas, to yourself, Fergal, and yourself, Jared. I agree with a lot that's in your opening statement, in particular the corporate tax receipts we've discussed here, actually, that it's this unexpected, unexplained windfall that really has helped us to plug significant holes in supplementary budgets in the last couple of years. For example, the overrun in health last year of 700 million, were it not for the corporate tax receipts, we'd be in a lot more difficulty. So there has been a lot of discussion at this committee around, should we bank that? Should we use it for, the rainy day fund, or as you've suggested, a strategic investment fund to ensure the capital projects are consistently delivered and that they're not hampered by any downturns that may come. And we know that inevitably we will have a downturn because that's the cycle, the economic cycle. Just to pick up on what Pat had said around connectivity, and it's interesting that you mentioned it actually, is that at the moment we have a public consultation that has just opened up with Irish Rail, and they're looking at the proposed extension of the Western Rail Corridor to complete phases 2 and 3. So phase 1 is complete and up and running, and it's the Ennis line, and it's doing very well actually, contrary to what some may have said might happen on that line. The second phase then is from into Tuam and then, into Athenry, Tuam and on to Claremorris. So phase 2 and phase 3. And I'd welcome your own thoughts on it, Fergal, in terms of IBEC's position, because from a West of Ireland perspective, we're very keen to develop the Atlantic Economic Corridor, to develop the Western Rail Link, and to eventually, in terms of bigger picture and a longer vision for the West and the North West, is that connectivity that Pat was talking about. How do we connect our major cities and growth hubs? And as you'll know, under the National Development Plan and Ireland 2040, Sligo has been identified as our growth centre for the North West. So what we want to see eventually is Galway connected into Mayo, up to Sligo and on up to Donegal to connect the Western seaboard. So what are your views on the Western Rail Corridor, and will IBEC be supporting it?
Thanks, Deputy. Yes, look, we've had extensive conversation already this afternoon about the risks we see in relation to the corporate tax receipts, and as I said, we very much believe this has to be the first budget that's going to stop the pattern of recent years. We should be putting this money aside for those strategic investments, infrastructure, education, innovation. Specifically on the infrastructure issue and on the regions, and Deputy Broughan, I very much share your sentiment that we need to build a world-class city. Right? Dublin operates in a different division, and that's the reality. And it needs to be funded to operate at that level. But we also think as a national organisation that we have too much of our economic activity inside the M50. So we have over 40% of the country's economic activity happening inside the M50. So this is suboptimal for Dublin, and it's suboptimal for the entire country. For a number of years, we've been advocating an ambition that we should be planning for an all-island population of 10 million people. Much to many people's surprise, we've actually hit 7. As a result of the recent budgets, when you round up the numbers. Right? So that's where the all-island population has gone to. So this is becoming an island of scale. We have challenges to make sure that that all-island economy is preserved, but it is becoming a market of scale. And most businesses, whether you're going to be in construction or whether you're another business, you view the all-island market as a single market. That's the way business predominantly works. We think there's a real opportunity to develop that counterbalance to Dublin, and that is the Atlantic Economic Corridor. Some of it is already becoming the reality. We've spoken about the initiatives we've seen in Limerick in terms of how that city is developing. We see it from an employer's perspective. The labour market dynamic of connecting Limerick and Galway, right? So that connectivity piece. When you connect those cities by motor and you bring down that travel time and you particularly get under 60 minutes, then the labour dynamic completely changes. So we now can see our companies, particularly in Limerick actually, people from Galway are commuting down on a daily basis. We need to make sure that commuting in the future is going to be probably of a more sustainable nature. We're still going to need that road infrastructure. So in terms of sequencing projects, our priorities is that we progress with a really ambitious Atlantic Economic Corridor, connecting Dublin, Limerick, Galway, and the whole way up the coast and all the way around to Belfast. It's that sea ring that will really make the all-island economy a reality. Rail will have a role to play within that, but we need to get the road infrastructure delivered. Lots of our members want to see opportunity around commercial industrial product movement on rail, and I think that's going to bring us some options as well, and particularly in the context of climate challenge. I think investment in rail, electrification, they all are going to be part of the solution. But our ambition in terms of supporting that Western Arc and particularly the Atlantic Economic Corridor is incredibly strong, because as a national organisation, that's what our members want to see happen. They want to see a greater spread of that economic activity, and we can't do it without the investment.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you that that sea, as you've outlined, right away along the western seaboard and back up into Belfast is key. And, you know, we want a good road infrastructure and a good road network, but we also want a decent rail network to give that option to citizens. And you touched upon the climate issue. And, you know, I mean, we look at the government's climate action plan that was published a couple of days ago. They're actively exploring the possibility of banning petrol and diesel cars from certain cities. I'm sure Galway will be included. And that's where the opportunity for rail really comes in. And if you consider the opportunity there for commuter services coming from Mayo into Galway to try and get the congestion out of Galway, to help some of the businesses that you represent in Parkmore, for example, that have a huge congestion issue, because we've discussed this. It's an ongoing discussion actually every year, particularly the industrial estates in Galway. They can't get their staff in and out, and they can't get their product in and out. So we need to take the cars out of the city, and rail presents an opportunity for us to do that. So I suppose my question, Mr. Ryan, is do you support the Western Rail Corridor, and will IBEC be supporting the public consultation by putting in a submission to that effect before the middle of July?
We're going to be engaging with our members on it, Deputy. It's a decision we haven't taken yet, but we are going to be really ambitious. Well, we're going to be really ambitious in terms of the investment agenda for road and rail infrastructure. Yeah,
and what's your own personal view on the Western Rail Corridor?
We haven't formed an opinion on it yet.
Have you formed an opinion?
We haven't. No,
we're
engaging with our members, and we will form an opinion on it.
You yourself, Mr. O'Brien, as a very experienced businessman, you might have looked at it perhaps, or I'm sure it's been brought to your attention on several occasions. You must have your own view on it.
Well, look, we'll express an IBEC view when we've engaged with our members, and we have a clear position of our members in terms of support for Western Rail Corridor. What's very clear at the moment is that ambition around investment in rail and road, and making sure that we're much more ambitious in terms of effective and balanced regional development, because at the moment we're not. That's our number one priority, and if rail is going to be a solution to that, then we're going to be supporting it.
Well, just to I'm sure you're aware of this, but the deadline for submissions is July 17th, so I would ask you to be as ambitious with your engagement with your members and ensure that a submission to the effect that you do support the exploration of that project. I think that if it's found to be financially viable and that it can support the numbers, I would love to see that the businesses in the west of Ireland will get behind that. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? If we're talking about a project like that today, the reality is if everybody says, yes, great, let's go ahead with it, we're talking probably 15 years before that would be done. Because that's what infrastructure is. By the time you do all of the work that has to be done, and Irish Rail would do it. So
the line already exists. It's already built, but it would have to be. It's not a project you'd be taking from scratch. It's been broken into 3 phases. Phase one has already been reopened. We're exploring the possibility of opening phase 2 and phase 3. So it's not the same as a brand new capital project, in that the infrastructure is already on the ground, but it would require revamping and reopening. So I take your point on the lead-in time.
You'll save the statutory process period, so you'd be able to go straight into the work you would have to do to get to construction, but you're probably still looking at about 10 years.
Well, we've been waiting quite some time, Pat, so I mean, we're ever the optimist.
I suppose the point I'm making is that when you're talking about infrastructure, you actually have to push the buttons early.
I suppose Ireland 2040 is looking at the next 22 years or whatever. So, you know, we are thinking longer term, and as Fergal has said, we're planning for, you know, population increase in the west of Ireland as well, not just in Dublin, Cork and Limerick and Galway. To go west and northwest, we want to see our population increase, and that won't happen without infrastructure and connectivity. So, the element of build it and they will come, I think it's the chicken and egg scenario. We're always being told we haven't got the population base there or the level of demand required, but we won't ever get that without the connectivity.
Infrastructure takes the faith.
They said the very same thing about Knock Airport, and thankfully Monsignor Horan didn't listen, and we have a fantastic airport in Ireland, West Knock, Airport Knock, and it's a massive attribute to the Western region. I think, Fergal, you'll agree that for businesses in the west of Ireland, that airport is fantastic.
We're going to. We're now pushing 6 o'clock. Just a couple of little things I want to just highlight out of in concluding. First of all, Fergal, just to say one thing to you. This committee here, in defence of us collectively, has very proactively highlighted the overruns in current expenditure, has had committee hearings on and investigations into how they were being paid for, and we have probably been to the forefront in terms of making some of the points which you have got around to making this year. The last year, Seamus Coffey made a lot of the BEPS argument. He was quizzed very extensively on it. He was one of the first people I heard talk about it. His view at the time, quite interestingly, was that while it was a very substantial threat to Irish economy greater than Brexit, I think he used exactly the same terminology, his view very much was that the likelihood of that level of an outcome wasn't as likely, if I remember correctly, on his view. You seem to have very much prejudged the outcome of what will come out of the next round. I know that the Government and the Minister for Finance has worked quite extensively with the OECD on this, and it is a collective means. And we need to remember that Ireland is not a solo voice in terms of looking at the issue within the OECD context. There are other countries, including countries now like the United States, which have a very different view in terms of corporate tax to some countries that would be closer to us in terms of EU members. I do think, though, it is obviously something that's very recognised and is there on the government's agenda as an issue and a concern. So it is something that we as a committee have looked at. I would make just one point, I suppose, Pat, in terms of your presentation. I nearly wondered at one point if you had read 2040 or anything connected to it, because, I mean, a lot of what's in 2040 talks about curtailing growth in Dublin and shifting growth out of Dublin to the regions. And yourself and your members and the government at the time, as you'd be well aware, contributed to the last decade, which is why it takes 10 years now to get infrastructure projects back up, because the economy was crashed. And that's what we're dealing with. And we forget sometimes, because of the effort of the people of Ireland and the governments that came after, who restored our economy. But we're coming from an awful crash. So there is an emphasis. And it's very disappointing when I hear somebody say that their members don't want to grow back up to the size they were. Even with the most chronic housing need in the country and an infrastructure project to 2040, that they don't view that as enough of an incentive to hire apprentices because they don't have ambition to do it. When you hear that, it doesn't worry. I begin to understand why, if I was telling my kid about certain apprenticeships, that I would be worried about saying to them to do that. Because, if you look at other dynamic industries which have, and I hope your submission when it looks at R&D and it looks at changes, because construction is a complete laggard in terms of the reform, the changing of processes, the driving innovation, compared to almost any other industry that's out there. So you need to look and see, there is huge opportunities, I believe, out there, both in the private and public sector. And I think if your members would share a little bit of that enthusiasm, I think it would be positive, much more positive. I would like to see it anyway.
If I may respond then, I suppose there's the industry we're in is cyclical, and there's a bunch of us that have been through these cycles before several times, and we never seem to learn from the lessons from the previous one. The one that we have just gone through has been incredibly deep. It really has hurt people to the extent that they're really, really cautious now. A lot of people went out of business. Some big companies, when they went out of business, their supply chain suffered. They didn't get bills paid. So a lot of people were in trouble. It's already a low margin business. So our main contractors would be earning profits of between 1% and 3%. And yet they take on massive risks in the projects that they do. It only takes a couple of projects to go wrong to put the biggest companies out of business. It's a very dangerous business from that point of view. So the confidence, and I suppose I should say, there's incredible stuff going on in construction. We have got people out there that have just got the can-do attitude, the problem-solving. They make things happen.
That's good to hear.
That is going on day in, day out in our industry. But the fact of the matter is we're running out of work. Our members in the Dublin area are not out of work. You go around to the regions and all you hear is there's nothing here. People are hopping in their cars and driving to Dublin, long journeys into Dublin, and now they don't want to go to Dublin anymore. They're saying, we don't want to put up with the traffic. They want to get work close to home. So there's an awful lot of different threads to this. And I suppose in regard to the innovation and the abilities to be productive, our top 50 companies have 30% of their turnover outside of Ireland. And that has happened because the big private employers that use our companies rate them to be among the best in the world, and they take them to other countries to build jobs for them rather than using the local industry. That's an incredible compliment to the people that work in the industry. But we have to have a pipeline of work ahead of us at home that allows people to invest. And right now they're afraid. Construction is not fun at the moment. It is not a fun business to be in. It tends to get a lot of negative press, and yet at the same time, when we put our people on site and we want to solve a problem, it's full of problem solvers. It's just that the lead-in to work starting in the ground is so long, so I wish Deputy Chambers the best in the world and push that hard, and it will happen, but it's not going to happen quickly, because that's the system we've got. And we need to learn that to make things happen, we have to press the button early. Every time we get to the end of a cycle, phone calls go into the CIF from different politicians asking the question, where are the shovel-ready projects? There is no such thing as a shovel-ready project without 4 or 5 years of lead-in work to make it shovel-ready. And the people that make that decision are the people holding the purse strings and allow the engineers and the surveyors and the consultations and all of that to take place on the projects to allow them to get on the shelf to be shovel-ready.
I have other people wanting to come back to me as well. So
I wouldn't accept for a minute for laggards. I think that's a misimpression, and we need to just brief you more.
I think there
I
can
hope
be.
you're not depending on Sean Barrett's article last week. It was actually scurrilous in terms of the lack of the ignorance he showed about the industry.
I'm not depending on any one person's article, but I do think there can be much more innovation in terms of how. And there is a number of articles, and I'm not going to refer to any one person's article, and in actual fact I would just ask you to withdraw the tone you used in relation to that person's article and work.
Well, I will be responding in kind in the paper.
Well, you can respond in whichever way, but you are aware here of the privilege which I indicated to you in advance, not to use.
Well, he took advantage of a full page in the newspaper.
Tom, that's
to
fair
ridicule
enough.
the industry.
Okay.
Very unfairly.
Well, that may be your view, but we will move on from that. I'm going to ask Jared to come in there. You wanted to come in and make your.
Just to come back on the comments about corporation tax in particular, I suppose where we see versus last year when Seamus Coffey made his comments about triple CDB, I think it was, rather than BEPS at the time, to where we are now, I think there's been a huge political change in the space of a year, 18 months in global corporate tax. Two things have changed. One is that when Seamus was talking about triple CTB, there was very little chance of it ever happening, purely because, and he put he said it would be important, but the odds of it happening are low because we had a veto at a European level, and so did other countries who backed it. At the OECD, in this BEPS process, there is no veto. So in effect, power talks. And if you look at who is pushing the proposals that we're talking about that are a risk for Ireland, it's pretty much every large country in the world is on one side of the table. And there's probably a handful of countries, along with ourselves, on the other side of the table saying, OK, well, we need to make this work for small countries. And as Fergal said in his opening statement, fundamentally this isn't about closing loopholes anymore. This is about who pays tax where, and big countries want more money paid into their exchequers because that's where the consumers are. So the politics of BEPS have changed hugely, and particularly the US position on tax has changed enormously over the past year, where we would have regarded them probably as being on our side of the table, as the same with Germany and our counterparts in Germany. Those two countries have switched sides of the table over the past year, which means that we think, and I put fairly high odds in it at this stage, that there will be an agreement at the OECD. Two things will happen. One is that some of our tax, no matter what the outcome of the negotiation, some of our tax under Pillar 1 of that agreement will go to other countries. We reckon that could be as high as €2 or €3 billion in a worst case scenario, but even in a relatively benign scenario, you're still talking about €1 billion lost from our tax base. It's probably going to be 2025 before you have implementation of this, right? So we have a time.
You're though pitching that at about €2 billion, and I think
in today's
we've heard figures of 3 plus. Or
yeah, it could be significantly worse in terms of the impact. It really depends on the detail, but you will lose significant share of money. We're not as worried about that. It's something for this committee to worry about because we have 5 years to get our act together in terms of how to pay for that. The other pillar is this minimum tax proposal. So it would effectively mean that there would be a global minimum corporate tax rate. If you paid 12.5% here and the global effective tax rate was agreed to be 15%, other countries would have the right to reach in to the Irish company and take out that extra 2.5%. In effect, it would mean the end of 12.5%, or the attractiveness of 12.5%. There's still a lot of debate to go. It could end up being fairly benign if it's a low number, less than 10. But we've heard numbers as high as 18 or 20. So there's still a lot of way to go. But the big dynamic that's shifted is that large countries want an agreement, and pretty much all countries want an agreement, because the alternative to an agreement is that countries will just implement this unilaterally on their own. So you'll see countries implement these taxes without an agreement, which would be even worse. So we think there's a significant risk, but we've got a time to get ready for that risk, and that means investing in innovation and education and SMEs so that we can rebalance the economy.
But there's not a very large, I won't get into this now, but in terms of that effective rate, that really is where this whole thing comes out in terms of impact. And from what I've read, which, everybody reads various articles, but it is more, I don't think, you seem to be taking a very pessimistic view as to where that effective rate could end up in terms of what you're talking about there, which is, I don't know if that's necessarily, as of yet, quite the case.
So I suppose there's a long way to go on it, but I know we sit, or I personally sit on the tax committee of business at the OECD, and those are the kind of numbers that we're hearing as the kind of rates. So, for example, the US already have a minimum rate of 13 through their guilty tax proposal. They're unlikely to want to go a lot lower than that. In this country, we're probably proposing something a lot lower than that. But as I said, the power dynamic is difficult, and there is there is a big challenge for Ireland there in that some of our traditional allies in these issues are on the other side now, so we really do have to start preparing for it.
Okay. I'm going to have to draw it to a conclusion. We are at 6:15. I not only thank you for your participation and your exchange of views with us today and the time you've given to the committee, but also again the apologies for the delay in getting started. I'd like to thank all the members as well for their contribution. It has been an interesting exchange of views. We are now going to stand adjourned until Wednesday the 25th at 4 p.m. Thank you.